Section 18 of The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2 by James Boswell. Section 18, 1775 continued. On Tuesday, April the 18th, he and I were engaged to go with Sir Joshua Reynolds to dine with Mr. Cambridge at his beautiful villa on the banks of the Thames near Twickenham. Dr. Johnson's tardiness was such that Sir Joshua, who had an appointment at Richmond early in the day, was obliged to go by himself on horseback, leaving his coach to Johnson and me. Johnson was in such good spirits that everything seemed to please him as we drove along. Our conversation turned on a variety of subjects. He thought portrait painting an improper employment for a woman. Public practice of any art, he observed, and staring in men's faces is very indelicate in a female. I happened to start a question whether, when a man knows that some of his intimate friends are invited to the house of another friend, with whom they are all equally intimate, he may join them without an invitation. Johnson: No, sir, he is not to go when he is not invited. They may be invited on purpose to abuse him, smiling. As a curious instance how little a man knows, or wishes to know, his own character in the world, or rather, as a convincing proof that Johnson's roughness was only external, and did not proceed from his heart, I insert the following dialogue. Johnson: It is wonderful, sir, how rare a quality good humour is in life. We meet with very few good-humoured men. I mentioned 4 of our friends, none of whom he would allow to be good-humoured. One was acid, another was muddy, and to the others he had objections which have escaped me. Then, shaking his head and stretching himself at ease in the coach, and smiling with much complacency, he turned to me and said, I look upon myself as a good-humoured fellow. The epithet fellow applied to the great lexicographer, the stately moralist, the masterly critic, as if he had been Sam Johnson, a mere pleasant companion, was highly diverting, and this light notion of himself struck me with wonder. I answered, also smiling, No, no, sir, that will not do. You are good-natured, but not good-humoured. You are irascible. You have not patience with folly and absurdity. I believe you would pardon them, if there were time to deprecate your vengeance, but punishment follows so quick after sentence that they cannot escape. I had brought with me a great bundle of Scotch magazines and newspapers, in which his Journey to the Western Islands was attacked in every mode, and I read a great part of them to him, knowing they would afford him entertainment. I wish the writers of them had been present. They would have been sufficiently vexed. One ludicrous imitation of his style, by Mr. Maclaurin, now one of the Scotch judges, with the title of Lord Dreghorn, was distinguished by him from the rude mass. This, said he, is the best, but I could caricature my own style much better myself. He defended his remark upon the general insufficiency of education in Scotland, and confirmed to me the authenticity of his witty saying on the learning of the Scotch. Their learning is like bread in a besieged town. Every man gets a little, but no man gets a full meal. There is, said he, in Scotland, a diffusion of learning, a certain portion of it widely and thinly spread. A merchant there has as much learning as one of their clergy. He talked of Isaac Walton's Lives, which was one of his most favourite books. Dr. Donne's life, he said, was the most perfect of them. He observed that it was wonderful that Walton, who was in a very low situation in life, should have been familiarly received by so many great men, and that at a time when the ranks of society were kept more separate than they are now. He supposed that Walton had then given up his business as a linen-draper and sempster, and was only an author, and added that he was a great panegyrist. Boswell: No quality will get a man more friends than a disposition to admire the qualities of others. I do not mean flattery, but a sincere admiration. Johnson. Nay, sir, flattery pleases very generally. In the first place, the flatterer may think what he says to be true, but in the second place, whether he thinks so or not, he certainly thinks those whom he flatters of consequence enough to be flattered. No sooner had we made our bow to Mr. Cambridge in his library, than Johnson ran eagerly to one side of the room, intent on poring over the backs of the books. Sir Joshua observed, aside, "He runs to the books as I do to the pictures, but I have the advantage. I can see much more of the pictures than he can of the books." Mr. Cambridge, upon this, politely said, "Dr. Johnson, I am going, with your pardon, to accuse myself, for I have the same custom which I perceive you have. But it seems odd that one should have such a desire to look at the backs of books." Johnson, ever ready for contest, instantly started from his reverie, wheeled about, and answered, "Sir, the reason is very plain. Knowledge is of two kinds. We know a subject ourselves, or we know where we can find information upon it. When we inquire into any subject, the first thing we have to do is to know what books have treated of it. This leads us to look at catalogues and the backs of books in libraries." Sir Joshua observed to me the extraordinary promptitude with which Johnson flew upon an argument. "Yes," said I, "he has no formal preparation, no flourishing with his sword, he is through your body in an instant." Johnson was here solaced with an elegant entertainment, a very accomplished family, and much good company, among whom was Mr. Harris of Salisbury, who paid him many compliments on his journey to the Western Islands. The common remark as to the utility of reading history being made, Johnson. "We must consider how very little history there is, I mean real authentic history. That certain kings reigned, and certain battles were fought, we can depend upon as true, but all the colouring, all the philosophy of history is conjecture." Boswell. "Then, sir, you would reduce all history to no better than an almanac, a mere chronological series of remarkable events." Mr. Gibbon, who must at that time have been employed upon his History, of which he published the first volume in the following year, was present, but did not step forth in defence of that species of writing. He probably did not like to trust himself with Johnson. Johnson observed that the force of our early habits was so great, that though reason approved, nay, though our senses relished a different course, almost every man returned to them. I do not believe there is any observation upon human nature better founded than this, and in many cases it is a very painful truth, for where early habits have been mean and wretched, the joy and elevation resulting from better modes of life must be damped by the gloomy consciousness of being under an almost inevitable doom to sink back into a situation which we recollect with disgust. It surely may be prevented by constant attention and unremitting exertion to establish contrary habits of superior efficacy. The Beggar's Opera, and the common question whether it was pernicious in its effects, having been introduced, Johnson. As to this matter, which has been very much contested, I myself am of opinion that more influence has been ascribed to The Beggar's Opera than it in reality ever had, for I do not believe that any man was ever made a rogue by being present at its representation. At the same time, I do not deny that it may have some influence, by making the character of a rogue familiar and in some degree pleasing. Then, collecting himself, as it were, to give a heavy stroke, there is in it such a labefactation of all principles as may be injurious to morality. While he pronounced this response, we sat in a comical sort of restraint, smothering a laugh, which we were afraid might burst out. In his Life of Gay, he has been still more decisive as to the inefficiency of the Beggar's Opera in corrupting society. But I have ever thought somewhat differently, for indeed not only are the gaiety and heroism of a highwayman very captivating to a youthful imagination, but the arguments for adventurous depredation are so plausible, the allusions so lively, and the contrasts with the ordinary and more painful modes of acquiring property are so artfully displayed, that it requires a cool and strong judgment to resist so imposing an aggregate. Yet I own I should be very sorry to have the Beggar's Opera suppressed, for there is in it so much of real London life, so much brilliant wit, and such a variety of airs, which, from early association of ideas, engage, soothe, and enliven the mind, that no performance which the theatre exhibits delights me more. The late worthy Duke of Queensberry, as Thomson in his Seasons justly characterises him, told me that when Gay first showed him the Beggar's Opera, his Grace's observation was, "This is a very odd thing, Gay. I am satisfied that it is either a very good thing or a very bad thing." It proved the former beyond the warmest expectations of the author or his friends. Mr. Cambridge, however, showed us to-day that there was good reason enough to doubt concerning its success. He was told by Quin that during the first night of its appearance it was long in a very dubious state, that there was a disposition to damn it, and that it was saved by the song, "O ponder well, be not severe," the audience being much affected by the innocent looks of Polly when she came to those two lines, which exhibit at once a painful and ridiculous image. "For on the rope that hangs, my dear, depends poor Polly's life." Quin himself had so bad an opinion of it that he refused the part of Captain Macheath and gave it to Walker, who acquired great celebrity by his grave yet animated performance of it. We talked of a young gentleman's marriage with an eminent singer, and his determination that she should no longer sing in public, though his father was very earnest that she should, because her talents would be liberally rewarded so as to make her a good fortune. It was questioned whether the young gentleman, who had not a shilling in the world, but was blessed with very uncommon talents, was not foolishly delicate or foolishly proud, and his father truly rational without being mean. Johnson, with all the high spirit of a Roman senator, exclaimed, "He resolved wisely and nobly, to be sure. He is a brave man. Would not a gentleman be disgraced by having his wife singing publicly for hire? No, sir, there can be no doubt here. I know not if I should not prepare myself for a public singer as readily as let my wife be one." Johnson arraigned the modern politics of this country as entirely devoid of all principle of whatever kind. "Politics," said he, "are now nothing more than means of rising in the world. With this sole view do men engage in politics, and their whole conduct proceeds upon it." How different in that respect is the state of the nation now from what it was in the time of Charles I, during the usurpation, and after the Restoration, in the time of Charles II. Hudibras affords a strong proof of how much hold political principles had then upon the minds of men. There is in Hudibras a great deal of bullion which will always last. But to be sure, the brighter strokes of his wit owed their force to the impression of the characters which was upon men's minds at the time, to their knowing them, at table and in the street, in short, being familiar with them, and above all, to his satire being directed against those whom a little while before they had hated and feared. The nation in general has ever been loyal, has been at all times attached to the monarch, though a few daring rebels have been wonderfully powerful for a time. The murder of Charles I was undoubtedly not committed with the approbation or consent of the people. Had that been the case, Parliament would not have ventured to consign the regicides to their deserved punishment. And we know what exuberance of joy there was when Charles II was restored. If Charles II had bent all his mind to it, had made it his sole object, he might have been as absolute as Louis XIV. A gentleman observed he would have done no harm if he had. Johnson. Why, sir, absolute princes seldom do any harm. But they who are governed by them are governed by chance. There is no security for good government. Cambridge. There have been many sad victims to absolute government. Johnson. So, sir, have there been to popular factions. Boswell. The question is, which is worst, one wild beast or many? Johnson praised the Spectator, particularly the character of Sir Roger de Coverley. He said, Sir Roger did not die a violent death, as has been generally fancied. He was not killed. He died only because others were to die, and because his death afforded an opportunity to Addison for some very fine writing. We have the example of Cervantes making Don Quixote die. I could never see why Sir Roger is represented as a little cracked. It appears to me that the story of the widow was intended to have something superinduced upon it, but the superstructure did not come. Somebody found fault with writing verses in a dead language, maintaining that they were merely arrangements of so many words, and laughed at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge for sending forth collections of them not only in Greek and Latin, but even in Syriac, Arabic, and other more unknown tongues. Johnson. I would have as many of these as possible. I would have verses in every language that there are the means of acquiring. Nobody imagines that an university is to have at once 200 poets, but it should be able to show 200 scholars. Peresque's death was lamented, I think, in 40 languages, and I would have had at every coronation, and every death of a king, every gaudium and every luctus, university verses in as many languages as can be acquired. I would have the world to be thus told, here is a school where everything may be learned. Having set out next day on a visit to the Earl of Pembroke at Wilton, and to my friend Mr. Temple at Mamhead in Devonshire, and not having returned to town till the 2nd of May, I did not see Dr. Johnson for a considerable time, and during the remaining part of my stay in London kept very imperfect notes of his conversation, which had I, according to my usual custom, written out at large soon after the time, much might have been preserved, which is now irretrievably lost. I can now only record some particular scenes, and a few fragments of his memorabilia. But to make some amends for my relaxation of diligence in one respect, I have to present my readers with arguments upon 2 law cases with which he favoured me. On Saturday the 6th of May, we dined by ourselves at the Mitre, and he dictated to me what follows, to obviate the complaint already mentioned, which had been made in the form of an action in the Court of Session by Dr. Memis of Aberdeen, that in the same translation of a charter in which physicians were mentioned, he was called a doctor of medicine. There are but 2 reasons for which a physician can decline the title of doctor of medicine: because he supposes himself disgraced by the doctorship, or supposes the doctorship disgraced by himself. To be disgraced by a title which he shares in common with every illustrious name of his profession, with Boerhaave, with Arbuthnot, and with Cullen, can surely diminish no man's reputation. It is, I suppose, to the doctorate from which he shrinks, that he owes his right of practising physic. A doctor of medicine is a physician under the protection of the laws, and by the stamp of authority. The physician, who is not a doctor, usurps a profession, and is authorized only by himself to decide upon health and sickness, and life and death. That this gentleman is a doctor, his diploma makes evident, a diploma not obtruded upon him, but obtained by solicitation, and for which fees were paid. With what countenance any man can refuse a title which he has either begged or bought is not easily discovered. All verbal injury must comprise in it either some false position, or some unnecessary declaration of defamatory truth. That in calling him doctor, a false appellation was given him, he himself will not pretend, who at the same time that he complains of the title, would be offended if we supposed him to be not a doctor. If the title of doctor be a defamatory truth, it is time to dissolve our colleges, for why should the public give salaries to men whose approbation is reproach? It may likewise deserve the notice of the public to consider what help can be given to the professors of physic, who all share with this unhappy gentleman the ignominious appellation, and of whom the very boys in the street are not afraid to say, "There goes the doctor." What is implied by the term doctor is well known. It distinguishes him to whom it is granted, as a man who has attained such knowledge of his profession as qualifies him to instruct others. A doctor of laws is a man who can form lawyers by his precepts. A doctor of medicine is a man who can teach the art of curing diseases. There is an old axiom which no man has yet thought fit to deny, nil dat quod non habet. Upon this principle to be doctor implies skill, for nemo docet quod non didicit. In England, whoever practises physic, not being a doctor, must practise by licence, but the doctorate conveys a licence in itself. By what accident it happened that he and the other physicians were mentioned in different terms, where the terms themselves were equivalent, or where in effect that which was applied to him was the most honourable, perhaps they who wrote the paper cannot now remember. Had they expected a lawsuit to have been the consequence of such petty variation, I hope they would have avoided it. But probably, as they meant no ill, they suspected no danger, and therefore consulted only what appeared to them propriety or convenience. A few days afterwards I consulted him upon a cause, Paterson and others, against Alexander and others, which had been decided by a casting vote in the Court of Sessions, determining that the Corporation of Stirling was corrupt, and setting aside the election of some of their officers, because it was proved that 3 of the leading men who influenced the majority had entered into an unjustifiable compact, of which, however, the majority were ignorant. He dictated to me, after a little consideration, the following sentences upon the subject. There is a difference between majority and superiority. Majority is applied to number, and superiority to power, and power, like many other things, is to be estimated non numero sed pondere. Now, though the greater number is not corrupt, the greater weight is corrupt, so that corruption predominates in the borough. Taken collectively, though perhaps taken numerically, the greater part may be uncorrupt. That borough, which is so constituted as to act corruptly, is in the eye of reason corrupt, whether it be by the uncontrollable power of a few, or by an accidental pravity of the multitude. The objection, in which is urged the injustice of making the innocent suffer with the guilty, is an objection not only against society, but against the possibility of society. All societies, great and small, subsist upon this condition, that, as the individuals derive advantages from union, they may likewise suffer inconveniences, that as those who do nothing, and sometimes those who do ill, will have the honours and emoluments of general virtue and general prosperity, so those likewise who do nothing, or perhaps do well, must be involved in the consequences of predominant corruption. This, in my opinion, was a very nice case, but the decision was firmed in the House of Lords. On Monday, May the 8th, we went together and visited the mansions of Bedlam. I had been informed that he had once been there before with Mr. Wedderburn, now Lord Loughborough, Mr. Murphy, and Mr. Foote, and I had heard Foote give a very entertaining account of Johnson's happenings to have his attention arrested by a man who was very furious, and who, while beating his straw, supposed it was William, Duke of Cumberland, whom he was punishing for his cruelties in Scotland in 1746. There was nothing particularly remarkable this day, but the general contemplation of insanity was very affecting. I accompanied him home, and dined and drank tea with him. Talking of an acquaintance of ours, distinguished for knowing an uncommon variety of miscellaneous articles, both in antiquities and polite literature, he observed, "You know, sir, he runs about with little weight upon his mind." And talking of another very ingenious gentleman, who from the warmth of his temper was at variance with many of his acquaintance, and wished to avoid them, he said, "Sir, he leads the life of an outlaw." On Friday, May the 12th, he had been so good as to assign me a room in his house, where I might sleep occasionally, when I happened to sit with him to a late hour. I took possession of it this night, found everything in excellent order, and was attended by honest Francis with the most civil assiduity. I asked Johnson whether I might go to a consultation with another lawyer upon Sunday, as that appeared to me to be doing work as much in my way as if an artisan should work on the day appropriated for religious rest. Johnson. Why, sir, when you are of consequence enough to oppose a practice of consulting upon Sunday, you should do it. But you may go now. It is not criminal, though it is not what one should do who is anxious for the preservation and increase of piety, to which a peculiar observance of Sunday is a great help. The distinction is clear between what is of moral and what is of ritual obligation. On Saturday, May the 13th, I breakfasted with him by invitation, accompanied by Mr. Andrew Crosby, a Scotch advocate, whom he had seen at Edinburgh, and the Honourable Colonel, now General, Edward Stopford, brother to Lord Cortown, who was desirous of being introduced to him. His tea and rolls and butter, and whole breakfast apparatus, were all in such decorum, and his behaviour was so courteous, that Colonel Stopford was quite surprised, and wondered at his having heard so much said of Johnson's slovenliness and roughness. I have preserved nothing of what passed, except that Crosby pleased him much by talking learnedly of alchemy, as to which Johnson was not a positive unbeliever, but rather delighted in considering what progress had actually been made in the transmutation of metals, what near approaches there had been to the making of gold, and told us that it was affirmed that a person in the Russian dominions had discovered the secret, but died without revealing it, as imagining it would be prejudicial to society. He added that it was not impossible, but it might in time be generally known. It being asked whether it was reasonable for a man to be angry at another whom a woman had preferred to him, Johnson: I do not see, sir, that it is reasonable for a man to be angry at another whom a woman has preferred to him, but angry he is, no doubt, and he is loath to be angry at himself. Before setting out for Scotland on the 23rd, I was frequently in his company at different places, but during this period have recorded only 2 remarks, one concerning Garrick. He has not Latin enough. He finds out the Latin by the meaning rather than the meaning by the Latin. And another concerning writers of travels, who, he observed, were more defective than any other writers. I passed many hours with him on the 17th, of which I find all my memorial is much laughing. It should seem he had that day been in a humour for jocularity and merriment, and upon such occasions I never knew a man laugh more heartily. We may suppose that the high relish of a state so different from his habitual gloom produced more than ordinary exertions of that distinguishing faculty of man which has puzzled philosophers so much to explain. Johnson's laugh was as remarkable as any circumstance in his manner. It was a kind of good-humoured growl. Tom Davies described it drolly enough. He laughs like a rhinoceros. To Bennet Langdon, Esquire. Dear Sir, I have an old amanuensis in great distress. I have given what I think I can give, and begged till I cannot tell where to beg again. I put into his hands this morning 4 guineas. If you could collect 3 guineas more, it would clear him from his present difficulty. I am, Sir, your most humble servant, Sam Johnson. May 21st, 1775, to James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, I make no doubt but you are now safely lodged in your own habitation, and have told all your adventures to Mrs. Boswell and Miss Veronica. Pray teach Veronica to love me. Bid her not to mind mamma. Mrs. Thrale has taken cold, and been very much disordered, but I hope is grown well. Mr. Langton went yesterday to Lincolnshire, and has invited Nicolida to follow him. Beauclerk talks of going to Bath. I am to set out on Monday, so there is nothing but dispersion. I have returned Lord Hales's entertaining sheets, but must stay till I come back for more, because it will be inconvenient to send them after me in my vagrant state. I promised Mrs. Macaulay that I would try to serve her son at Oxford. I have not forgotten it, nor am unwilling to perform it. If they desire to give him an English education, it should be considered whether they cannot send him for a year or 2 to an English school. If he comes immediately from Scotland, he can make no figure in our universities. The schools in the north, I believe, are cheap, and, when I was a young man, were eminently good. There are 2 little books published by the Foulis, Telemachus and Collins's poems, each a shilling. I would be glad to have them. Make my compliments to Mrs. Boswell, though she does not love me. You see what perverse things ladies are, and how little fit to be trusted with feudal estates. When she mends and loves me, there may be more hope of her daughters. I will not send compliments to my friends by name, because I would be loath to leave out any in the enumeration. Tell them, as you see them, how well I speak of Scotch politeness, and Scotch hospitality, and Scotch beauty, and of everything Scotch, but Scotch oatcakes and Scotch prejudices. Let me know the answer of Rasay, and the decision relating to Sir Alan. I am, my dearest sir, with great affection, your most obliged and most humble servant, Sam Johnson. May the 27th, 1775. After my return to Scotland, I wrote 3 letters to him, from which I extract the following passages. I have seen Lord Hailes since I came down. He thinks it wonderful that you are pleased to take so much pains in revising his annals. I told him that you said you were well rewarded by the entertainment which you had in reading them. There has been a numerous flight of Hebrideans in Edinburgh this summer, whom I have been happy to entertain at my house. Mr. Donald Macqueen and Lord Monboddo supped with me one evening. They joined in controverting your proposition that the Gaelic of the Highlands and Isles of Scotland was not written till of late. My mind has been somewhat dark this summer. I have need of your warming and vivifying rays, and I hope I shall have them frequently. I am going to pass some time with my father at Auchinleck. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, I am returned from the annual ramble into the Middle Counties. Having seen nothing I had not seen before, I have nothing to relate. Time has left that part of the island few antiquities, and commerce has left the people no singularities. I was glad to go abroad, and perhaps glad to come home, which is, in other words, I was, I am afraid, weary of being at home, and weary of being abroad. Is this not the state of life? But if we confess this weariness, let us not lament it, for all the wise and all the good say that we may cure it. For the black fumes which rise in your mind, I can prescribe nothing but that you disperse them by honest business or innocent pleasure, and by reading, sometimes easy and sometimes serious. Change of place is useful, and I hope that your residence at Auchinleck will have many good effects. That I should have given pain to Rasay, I am sincerely sorry, and am therefore very much pleased that he is no longer uneasy. He still thinks that I have represented him as personally giving up the chieftainship. I meant only that it was no longer contested between the 2 houses, and supposed it settled, perhaps by the session of some remote generation in the house of Dunvegan. I am sorry the advertisement was not continued for 3 or 4 times in the paper. That Lord Monboddo and Mr. Macqueen should controvert a position contrary to the imaginary interest of literary or national prejudice might be easily imagined, but of a standing fact there ought to be no controversy. If there are men with tails, catch an homo caudatus. If there was writing of old in the Highlands or Hebrides, in the Erse language, produce the manuscripts. Where men write, they will write to one another, and some of their letters, in families studious of their ancestry, will be kept. In Wales there are many manuscripts. I have now 3 parcels of Lord Hailes's history, which I purpose to return all the next week. That his respect for my little observations should keep his work in suspense makes one of the evils of my journey. It is in our language, I think, a new mode of history, which tells all that is wanted, and, I suppose, all that is known, without laboured splendour of language, or affected subtlety of conjecture. The exactness of his dates raises my wonder. He seems to have the closeness of Henault without his constraint. Mrs. Thrale was so entertained with your journal that she almost read herself blind. She has a great regard for you. Of Mrs. Boswell, though she knows in her heart that she does not love me, I am always glad to hear any good, and hope that she and the little dear ladies will have neither sickness nor any other affliction. But she knows that she does not care what becomes of me, and for that she may be sure that I think her very much to blame. Never, my dear sir, do you take it into your head that I do not love you. You may settle yourself in full confidence both of my love and my esteem. I love you as a kind man, I value you as a worthy man, and hope in time to reverence you as a man of exemplary piety. I hold you, as Hamlet has it, in my heart of hearts, and therefore it is little to say that I am, sir, Your affectionate humble servant, Sam Johnson, London, August the 27th, 1775. To the same. Sir, if in these papers there is little alteration attempted, do not suppose me negligent. I have read them perhaps more closely than the rest, but I find nothing worthy of an objection. Write to me soon and write often, and tell me all your honest heart. I am, Sir, yours affectionately, Sam Johnson, August 30th, 1775. To the same. My dear Sir, I now write to you, lest in some of your freaks and humours you should fancy yourself neglected. Such fancies I must entreat you never to admit, at least never to indulge, for my regard for you is so radicated and fixed, that it is become part of my mind, and cannot be effaced but by some cause uncommonly violent. Therefore, whether I write or not, set your thoughts at rest. I now write to tell you that I shall not very soon write again, for I am to set out to-morrow on another journey. Your friends are all well at Streatham and in Leicester Fields. Make my compliments to Mrs. Boswell, if she is in good humour with me. I am, Sir, etc., Samuel Johnson, September 14th, 1775. What he mentions in such light terms as, I am to set out to-morrow on another journey, I soon afterwards discovered was no less than a tour to France with Mr. and Mrs. Thrale. This was the only time in his life that he went upon the continent. To Mr. Robert Levet, September 18th, 1775, Calais. Dear Sir, we are here in France, after a very pleasing passage of no more than 6 hours. I know not when I shall write again, and therefore I write now, though you cannot suppose that I shall have much to say. You have seen France yourself. From this place we are going to Rouen, and from Rouen to Paris, where Mr. Thrale designs to stay about 5 or 6 weeks. We have a regular recommendation to the English resident, so we shall not be taken for vagabonds. We think to go one way and return another, and for (query C) as much as we can. I will try to speak a little French. I tried hitherto but little, but I spoke sometimes. If I heard better, I suppose I should learn faster. I am, Sir, your humble servant, Sam Johnson. To the same. Paris, October 22nd, 1775. Dear Sir, we are still here, commonly very busy in looking about us. We have been to-day at Versailles. You have seen it, and I shall not describe it. We came yesterday from Fontainebleau, where the court is now. We went to see the King and Queen at dinner, and the Queen was so impressed by Miss that she sent one of the gentlemen to inquire who she was. I find all true that you have ever told me of Paris. Mr. Thrale is very liberal, and keeps us 2 coaches and a very fine table, but I think our cookery very bad. Mrs. Thrale got into a convent of English nuns, and I talked with her through the grate, and I am very kindly used by the English Benedictine friars. But upon the whole I cannot make much acquaintance here, and though the churches, palaces, and some private houses are very magnificent, there is no very great pleasure, after having seen so many, in seeing more. At least, the pleasure, whatever it be, must sometime have an end, and we are beginning to think when we shall come home. Mr. Thrale calculates that, as we left Streatham on the 15th of September, we shall see it again about the 15th of November. I think I had not been on this side of the sea 5 days before I found a sensible improvement in my health. I ran a race in the rain this day, and beat Baretti. Baretti is a fine fellow, and speaks French, I think, quite as well as English. Make my compliments to Mrs. Williams, and give my love to Francis, and tell my friends that I am not lost. I am, dear Sir, your affectionate, humble, etc., Sam Johnson. To Dr. Samuel Johnson, Edinburgh, October 24th, 1775. My dear Sir, if I had not been informed that you were at Paris, you should have had a letter from me by the earliest opportunity, announcing the birth of my son on the 9th instant. I have named him Alexander after my father. I now write, as I suppose your fellow traveller, Mr. Thrale, will return to London this week, to attend his duty in Parliament, and that you will not stay behind him. I send another parcel of Lord Hailes's Annals. I have undertaken to solicit you for a favour to him, which he thus requests in a letter to me. I intend soon to give you the Life of Robert Bruce, which you will be pleased to transmit to Dr. Johnson. I wish that you could assist me in a fancy which I have taken, of getting Dr. Johnson to draw a character of Robert Bruce, from the account that I give of that prince. If he finds materials for it in my work, it will be a proof that I have been fortunate in selecting the most striking incidents. I suppose by the Life of Robert Bruce his lordship means that part of his annals which relates the history of that prince, and not a separate work. Shall we have a journey to Paris from you in the winter? You will, I hope, at any rate be kind enough to give me some account of your French travels very soon, for I am very impatient. What a different scene have you viewed this autumn, from that which you viewed in autumn 1773! I ever am, my dear Sir, your much obliged and affectionate humble servant, James Boswell. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, I am glad that the young laird is born, and an end, as I hope, put to the only difference that you can ever have with Mrs. Boswell. I know that she does not love me, but I intend to persist in wishing her well till I get the better of her. Paris is, indeed, a place very different from the Hebrides, but it is to a hasty traveller not so fertile of novelty, nor affords so many opportunities of remark. I cannot pretend to tell the public anything of a place better known to many of my readers than to myself. We can talk of it when we meet. I shall go next week to Streatham, from whence I propose to send a parcel of the history every post. Concerning the character of Bruce, I can only say that I do not see any great reason for writing it, but I shall not easily deny what Lord Hailes and you concur in desiring. I have been remarkably healthy all the journey, and hope you and your family have known only that trouble and danger which has so happily terminated. Among all the congratulations that you may receive, I hope you believe none more warm or sincere than those of, dear Sir, your most affectionate Sam Johnson. November 16th, 1775. To Mrs. Lucy Porter in Lichfield. Dear Madam, this week I came home from Paris. I have brought you a little box which I thought pretty, but I know not whether it is properly a snuff box or a box for some other use. I will send it when I can find an opportunity. I have been through the whole journey remarkably well. My fellow travellers were the same whom you saw at Lichfield, only we took Baretti with us. Paris is not so fine a place as you would expect. The palaces and churches, however, are very splendid and magnificent, and what would please you, there are many very fine pictures, but I do not think their way of life commodious or pleasant. Let me know how your health has been all this while. I hope the fine summer has given you strength sufficient to encounter the winter. Make my compliments to all my friends, and if your fingers will let you, write to me, or let your maid write, if it be troublesome to you. I am, dear Madam, your most affectionate humble servant, Sam Johnson. November 16th, 1775. To the same. Dear Madam, some weeks ago I wrote to you to tell you that I was just come home from a ramble, and hoped that I should have heard from you. I am afraid winter has laid hold on your fingers and hinders you from writing. However, let somebody write if you cannot, and tell me how you do, and a little of what has happened at Lichfield among our friends. I hope you are all well. When I was in France I thought myself growing young, but am afraid that cold weather will take part of my new vigour from me. Let us, however, take care of ourselves, and lose no part of our health by negligence. I never knew whether you received the Commentary on the New Testament, and the Travels, and the Glasses. Do, my dear love, write to me, and do not let us forget each other. This is the season of good wishes, and I wish you all good. I have not lately seen Mr. Porter, nor heard of him. Is he with you? Be pleased to make my compliments to Mrs. Addy and Mrs. Cobb and all my friends, and when I can do any good, let me know. I am, dear Madam, yours most affectionately, Samuel Johnson. December 1775. End of section 18.
Section 19 of The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Len Nicholson. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2, by James Boswell. Section 19, 1775, continued. It is to be regretted that he did not write an account of his travels in France, for as he is reported to have once said that he could write the life of a broomstick, so, notwithstanding so many former travellers have exhausted almost every subject for remark in that great kingdom, his very accurate observation and peculiar vigour of thought and illustration would have produced a valuable work. During his visit to it, which lasted but about 2 months, he wrote notes or minutes of what he saw. He promised to show me them, but I neglected to put him in mind of it, and the greatest part of them has been lost, or perhaps destroyed in a precipitate burning of his papers a few days before his death, which must ever be lamented. One small paper book, however, entitled France Too, has been preserved, and is in my possession. It is a diurnal register of his life and observations, from the 10th of October to the 4th of November, inclusive, being 26 days, and shows an extraordinary attention to various minute particulars. Being the only memorial of this tour that remains, my readers, I am confident, will peruse it with pleasure, though his notes are very short, and evidently written only to assist his own recollection. October 10, Tuesday. We saw the École Militaire, in which 150 young boys are educated for the army. They have arms of different sizes according to the age, flints of wood. The building is very large, but nothing fine, except the council room. The French have large squares in the windows. They make good iron palisades. Their meals are gross. We visited the observatory, a large building of a great height. The upper stones of the parapet very large, but not cramped with iron. The flat on the top is very extensive, but on the insulated part there is no parapet. Though it was broad enough, I did not care to go upon it. Maps were printing in one of the rooms. We walked to a small convent of the Fathers of the Oratory. In the reading desk of the refectory lay the Lives of the Saints. October 11, Wednesday. We went to see Hôtel de Châtelois, a house not very large, but very elegant. One of the rooms was gilt to a degree that I never saw before. The upper part for servants and their masters was pretty. Thence we went to Mr. Monville's, a house divided into small apartments, furnished with effeminate and minute elegance, porphyry. Thence we went to Saint Roch's church, which is very large, the lower part of the pillars encrusted with marble. 3 chapels behind the high altar, the last a mass of low arches. Altars, I believe, all around. We passed through Place de Vendôme, a fine square, about as big as Hanover Square, inhabited by the high families, Louis XIV on horseback in the middle. Monville is the son of a farmer general. In the house of Châtelois is a room furnished with Japan, fitted up in Europe. We dined with Bocage, the Marquis Blanchetti and his lady. The sweetmeats taken by the Marchioness Blanchetti, after observing that they were dear. Mr. Leroy, Count Manucci, the Abbé, the Prior, and Father Wilson, who stayed with me till I took him home in the coach. Battiani is gone. The French have no laws for the maintenance of their poor. Monk not necessarily a priest. Benedictines rise at 4, are at church an hour and half, at church again half an hour before, half an hour after dinner, and again from half an hour after 7 to 8. They may sleep 8 hours. Bodily labour wanted in monasteries. The poor taken to hospitals and miserably kept. Monks in the convent 15, accounted poor. October 12, Thursday. We went to the Gobelin. Tapestry makes a good picture, imitates flesh exactly. one piece with a gold ground, the birds not exactly coloured. Thence we went to the King's cabinet, very neat, not perhaps perfect. Gold ore, candles of the candle tree, seeds, woods. Thence to Gagner's house, where I saw rooms 9, furnished with a profusion of wealth and elegance which I never had seen before. Vases, pictures, the dragon china. The lustre said to be of crystal, and to have cost £3,500. The whole furniture said to have cost £125,000. Damask hangings covered with pictures. Porphyry. This house struck me. Then we waited on the ladies to Monville's. Captain Irwin with us. Spain. County towns all beggars. At Dijon he could not find the way to Orleans. Crossroads of France very bad. 5 soldiers. Women. Soldiers escaped. The colonel would not lose 5 men for the death of 1 woman. The magistrate cannot seize a soldier but by the colonel's permission. Good inn at Nîmes. Moors of Barbary fond of Englishmen. Gibraltar eminently healthy. It has beef from Barbary. There is a large garden. Soldiers sometimes fall from the rock. October 13, Friday. I stayed at home all day, only went to find the prior, who was not at home. I read something in Canis. Nec admiror, nec multum laudo. October 14, Saturday. We went to the house of Mr. Argenson, which was almost wainscoted with looking-glasses, and covered with gold. The ladies' closet wainscoted with large squares of glass over painted paper. They always place mirrors to reflect their rooms. Then we went to Julien's, the treasurer of the clergy. £30,000 a year. The house has no very large room, but is set with mirrors and covered with gold. Books of wood here, and in another library. At D's I looked into the books in the ladies' closet, and in contempt showed them to Mr. T. Prince Titi, Bible des Fées, and other books. She was offended, and shut up, as we heard afterwards, her apartment. Then we went to Julien Leroy, the king's watchmaker, a man of character in his business, who showed a small clock made to find the longitude. A decent man. Afterwards we saw the Palais Marchand and the courts of justice, civil and criminal. Queries on the Sellette. This building has the old Gothic passages, and a great appearance of antiquity. 300 prisoners sometimes in the jail. Much disturbed. Hope no ill will be. In the afternoon I visited Mr. Fréron, the journalist. He spoke Latin very scantily, but seemed to understand me. His house not splendid, but of commodious size. His family, wife, son, and daughter, not elevated, but decent. I was pleased with my reception. He is to translate my books, which I am to send him with notes. October 15, Sunday. At Choisy, a royal palace on the banks of the Seine, about 7 miles from Paris. The terrace, noble along the river. The rooms numerous and grand, but not discriminated from other palaces. The chapel beautiful, but small. China globes, inlaid tables, labyrinth, sinking table, toilet tables. October 16, Monday. The Palais Royal very grand, large, and lofty. A very great collection of pictures. 3 of Raphael, 2 Holy Family, 1 small piece of M. Angelo, 1 room of Rubens. I thought the pictures of Raphael fine. The Tuileries, statues, Venus, Aeneas and Anchises in his arms, Nilus, many more. The walks not open to mean persons. Chairs at night hired for 2 sous apiece. Pont tournant. Austin nuns, great. Mrs. Fermor, abbess. She knew Pope, and thought him disagreeable. Mrs. Blank has many books, has seen life. Their frontlet disagreeable, their hood, their life easy. Rise about 5, hour and half in chapel, dine at 10. Another hour and half at chapel, half an hour about 3, and half an hour more at 7. 4 hours in chapel. A large garden. 13 pensioners. Teacher complained. At the boulevards saw nothing, yet was glad to be there. Rope dancing and farce. Egg dance. Note: near Paris, whether on weekdays or Sundays, the road's empty. October 17, Tuesday. At the Palais Marchand I bought a snuff-box, 24 livres, blank, 6 livres, table-book, 15 livres, scissors, 3 pairs, 18 livres. All in all, 63 livres, amounting to £2 12 6. We heard the lawyers plead. Note: as many killed at Paris as there are days in the year. Chambre de question. Tournelle at the Palais Marchand. An old venerable building. The Palais Bourbon belonging to the Prince of Condé. Only one small wing shown. Lofty, splendid, gold and glass. The battles of the great Condé are painted in one of the rooms. The present prince a grandsire at 39. The sight of palaces and other great buildings leaves no very distinct images, unless to those who talk of them. As I entered, my wife was in my mind. She would have been pleased. Having now nobody to please, I am little pleased. Note: in France there is no middle rank. So many shops open that Sunday is little distinguished at Paris. The palaces of Louvre and Tuileries granted out in lodgings. In the Palais de Bourbon, gilt globes of metal at the fireplace. The French beds commended. Much of the marble only paste. The Colosseum a mere wooden building, at least much of it. October 18, Wednesday. We went to Fontainebleau, which we found a large mean town crowded with people. The forest thick with woods, very extensive. Manucci secured us lodgings. The appearance of the country pleasant, no hills, few streams, only one hedge. I remember no chapels nor crosses on the road. Pavement still, and rows of trees. Note: nobody but mean people walk in Paris. October 19, Thursday. At court we saw the apartments, the king's bedchamber and council chamber extremely splendid. Persons of all ranks in the external rooms through which the family passes, servants and masters. Brunet with us the second time. The introductor came to us, civil to me, presenting. I had scruples. Not necessary. We went and saw the king and queen at dinner. We saw the other ladies at dinner. Madame Elizabeth with the Princess of Guimené. At night we went to a comedy. I neither saw nor heard. Drunken women. Mrs. T.H. preferred one to the other. October 20, Friday. We saw the Queen mount in the forest. Brown habit. Rode aside. One lady rode aside. The Queen's horse light grey. Martingale. She galloped. We then went to the apartments and admired them. Then wandered through the palace. In the passages, stalls and shops. Painting in fresco by a great master, worn out. We saw the king's horses and dogs. The dogs almost all English, degenerate. The horses not much commended. The stables cool, the kennel filthy. At night the ladies went to the opera. I refused, but should have been welcome. The king fed himself with his left hand as we. Saturday, 21. In the night I got ground. We came home to Paris. I think we did not see the chapel. Tree broken by the wind. The French chairs made all of boards painted. Note: soldiers at the Court of Justice. Soldiers not amenable to the magistrates. Dijon woman. Faggots in the palace. Everything slovenly, except in the chief rooms. Trees in the roads, some tall, none old, many very young and small. Women's saddles seem ill made. Queen's bridle woven with silver. Tags to strike the horse. Sunday, October 22. To Versailles, a mean town. Carriages of business passing. Mean shops against the wall. Our way lay through Sèvres, where the china manufacture. Wooden bridge at Sèvres, in the way to Versailles. The palace of great extent. The front long. I saw it not perfectly. The menagerie. Cygnets dark, their black feet. On the ground. Tame. Halcyons or gulls. Stag and hind, young. Aviary, very large. The net, wire. Black stag of China, small. Rhinoceros, the horn broken and pared away, which I suppose will grow. The basis, I think, 4 inches cross. The skin folds like loose cloth doubled over his body and cross his hips. A vast animal, though young. As big, perhaps, as 4 oxen. The young elephant, with his tusks just appearing. The brown bear put out his paws. All very tame. The lion. The tigers I did not well view. The camel, or dromedary, with 2 bunches called the huguin, taller than any horse. 2 camels with 1 bunch. Among the birds was a pelican, who being let out, went to a fountain and swam about to catch fish. His feet well webbed. He dipped his head and turned his long bill sidewise. He caught 2 or 3 fish, but did not eat them. Trianon is a kind of retreat appendant to Versailles. It has an open portico, the pavement, and I think the pillars, of marble. There are many rooms, which I do not distinctly remember. A table of porphyry, about 5 feet long and between 2 and 3 broad, given to Louis XIV by the Venetian state. In the council room, almost all that was not door or window was, I think, looking-glass. Little Trianon is a small palace like a gentleman's house. The upper floor paved with brick. Little Vienne. The court is ill paved. The rooms at the top are small, fit to soothe the imagination with privacy. In the front of Versailles are small basins of water on the terrace, and other basins, I think, below them. There are little courts. The great gallery is wainscoted with mirrors, not very large, but joined by frames. I suppose the large plates were not yet made. The playhouse was very large. The chapel I do not remember if we saw. We saw 1 chapel, but I am not certain whether there or at Trianon. The Foreign Office paved with bricks. The dinner half a louis each, and I think a louis over. Money given at menagerie. 3 livres, at palace 6 livres. October 23, Monday. Last night I wrote to Levitt. We went to see the looking-glasses wrought. They come from Normandy in cast plates, perhaps the 1/3 of an inch thick. At Paris they are ground upon a marble table, by rubbing one plate upon another with grit between them. The various sands, of which there are said to be 5, I could not learn. The handle, by which the upper glass is moved, has the form of a wheel, which may be moved in all directions. The plates are sent up with their surfaces ground, but not polished, and so continue till they are bespoken, lest time should spoil the surface, as we were told. Those that are to be polished are laid on a table, covered with several thick cloths, hard strained that the resistance may be equal. They are then rubbed with a hand rubber, held down hard by a contrivance which I did not well understand. The powder which is used last seemed to me to be iron dissolved in aqua fortis. They called it, as Baretti said, marque de Beaufort, which he thought was dregs. They mentioned vitriol and saltpetre. The cannonball swam in the quicksilver. To silver them, a leaf of beaten tin is laid and rubbed with quicksilver, to which it unites. Then more quicksilver is poured upon it, which by its mutual attraction rises very high. Then a paper is laid at the nearest end of the plate, over which the glass is slided till it lies upon the plate, having driven much of the quicksilver before it. It is then, I think, pressed upon cloths, and then set sloping to drop the superfluous mercury. The slope is daily heightened towards a perpendicular. In the way I saw the Grieve, the mayor's house, and the Bastille. We then went to Santerre, a brewer. He brews with about as much malt as Mr. Thrale, and sells his beer at the same price, though he pays no duty for malt, and little more than half as much for beer. Beer is sold retail at 6 a bottle. He brews 4,000 barrels a year. There are 17 brewers in Paris, of whom none is supposed to brew more than he. Reckoning them at 3,000 each, they make 51,000 a year. They make their malt, for malting is here no trade. The moat of the Bastille is dry. October 24, Tuesday. We visited the King's Library. I saw the Speculum Humanae Salvationis rudely printed with ink, sometimes pale, sometimes black. Part supposed to be with wooden types, and part with pages cut on boards. The Bible, supposed to be older than that of Mentz in 62. It has no date. It is supposed to have been printed with wooden types. I am in doubt. The print is large and fair, in 2 folios. Another book was shown me, supposed to have been printed with wooden types. I think Durandi Sanctuarium in 58. This is inferred from the difference of form sometimes seen in the same letter, which might be struck with different puncheons. The regular similitude of most letters proves better that they are metal. I saw nothing but the speculum, which I had not seen, I think, before. Thence to the Sorbonne, the library very large, not in lattices like the King's. Marbone and Duranda, quarto collection, 14 volumes, Scriptores de Rebus Gallicis, many folios. Histoire généalogique of France, 9 volumes. Gallia Christiana, the first edition, quarto, the last folio, 12 volumes. The prior and librarian dined with us. I waited on them home. Their garden pretty, with covered walks, but small, yet may hold many students. The doctors of the Sorbonne are all equal. Choose those who succeed to vacancies. Profit little. October 25, Wednesday. I went with the prior to St. Cloud to see Dr. Hook. We walked round the palace and had some talk. I dined with our whole company at the monastery. In the library, Berold, Cymon, Titus from Boccace, Oratio Proverbialis to the Virgin from Petrarch, Falkland to Sands, Dryden's preface to the 3rd volume of Miscellanies. October 26, Thursday. We saw the china at Sèvres, cut, glazed, painted. Bellevue, a pleasing house, not great. Fine prospect. Meudon, an old palace. Alexander in porphyry, hollow between eyes and nose, thin cheeks. Plato and Aristotle. Noble terrace overlooks the town, St. Cloud. Gallery not very high, nor grand, but pleasing. In the rooms, Michelangelo, drawn by himself. Sir Thomas More, Descartes, Bochart, Naudacus, Mazarin. Gilded wainscot, so common that it is not minded. Gough and Keene. Hook came to us at the inn. A message from Drumgold. October 27, Friday. I stayed at home. Gough and Keene and Mrs. Essie's friend dined with us. This day we began to have a fire. The weather has grown very cold, and I fear has a bad effect upon my breath, which has grown much more free and easy in this country. Saturday, October 28. I visited the Grand Chartreux built by St. Louis. It is built for 40, but contains only 24, and will not maintain more. The friar that spoke to us had a pretty apartment. Mr. Baretti says 4 rooms. I remember but 3. His books seemed to be French. His garden was neat. He gave me grapes. We saw the Place de Victoire, with the statues of the king and the captive nations. We saw the palace and gardens of Luxembourg, but the gallery was shut. We climbed to the top stairs. I dined with Colebrook, who had much company. Foote, Sir George Rodney, Motta, Hudson, Taff. Called on the prior, and found him in bed. Hotel, £1 a day. Coach, 3 guineas a week. Valet de place, 3 livres a day. Avant-coureur, £1 a week. Ordinary dinner, 6 livres a head. Our ordinary seems to be about 5 guineas a day. Our extraordinary expenses, as diversions, gratuities, clothes, I cannot reckon. Our travelling is 10 guineas a day. White stockings, 18 livres. Wig. Hat. Sunday, October 29. We saw the boarding school. The Enfants Trouvés. A room with about 86 children in cradles, as sweet as a parlour. They lose a third. Take in to perhaps more than 7 years old. Put them to trades. Pin to them the papers sent with them. Want nurses. Saw their chapel. Went to St. Eustatia. Saw an innumerable company of girls catechized, in many bodies, perhaps 100 to a catechist. Boys taught at one time, girls at another. The sermon. The preacher wears a cap, which he takes off at the name. His action uniform, not very violent. October 30, Monday. We saw the library of Saint-Germain, a very noble collection. Codex Divinorum Officiorum, 1459. A letter, square like that of the offices, perhaps the same. The Codex, by Fust and Gernsheim. Mercius, 12-volume folio. Amadis, in French, 3-volume folio. Catholicon sine colophon, but of 1460. 2 other editions, one by Augustin, De Civitate Dei, without name, date, or place, but of Fust's square letter, as it seems. I dined with Colonel Drumgold, had a pleasing afternoon. Some of the books of Saint-Germain stand in presses from the wall, like those at Oxford. October 31, Tuesday. I lived at the Benedictines. Meagre day. Soup meagre, herrings, eels, both with sauce, fried fish, lentils, tasteless in themselves. In the library, where I found Matthias's De Historia Indica, Promontorium Flectere to double the Cape. I parted very tenderly from the prior and Friar Wilkes. Maître des Arts, 2 years. Bac Theol, 3 years. Licentiate, 2 years. Dr. Th, 2 years. In all 9 years. For the doctorate, 3 disputations. Major, minor, Sorbonica. Several colleges suppressed, and transferred to that which was the Jesuits' College. November 1, Wednesday. We left Paris. Saint-Denis, a large town. The church not very large, but the middle aisle is very lofty and awful. On the left are chapels built beyond the line of the wall, which destroy the symmetry of the sites. The organ is higher above the pavement than any I have ever seen. The gates are of brass. On the middle gate is the history of our Lord. The painted windows are historical, and said to be eminently beautiful. We were at another church belonging to a convent, of which the portal is a dome. We could not enter further, and it was almost dark. November 2, Thursday. We came this day to Chantilly, the seat belonging to the Prince of Condé. This place is eminently beautified by all varieties of waters, starting up in fountains, falling in cascades, running in streams, and spread in lakes. The water seems to be too near the house. All this water is brought from a source or river 3 leagues off, by an artificial canal, which for 1 league is carried underground. The house is magnificent. The cabinet seems well stocked. What I remember was the jaws of a hippopotamus, and a young hippopotamus preserved, which however is so small that I doubt its reality. It seems too hairy for an abortion, and too small for a mature birth. Nothing was in spirits, all was dry. The dog, the deer, the ant-bear with long snout, the toucan, long broad beak. The stables were of very great length. The kennel had no sense. There was a mockery of a village. The menagerie had few animals. For Dr. Blagden, see Post, 1780, in Mr. Langton's collection. 2 faussons, or Brazilian weasels, spotted, very wild. There is a forest, and I think a park. I walked till I was very weary, and next morning felt my feet battered, and with pains in the toes. November 3, Friday. We came to Compiègne, a very large town, with a royal palace built round a pentagonal court. The court is raised upon vaults, and has, I suppose, an entry on one side by a gentle rise. Talk of painting. The church is not very large, but very elegant and splendid. I had at first great difficulty to walk, but motion grew continually easier. At night we came to Noyon, an episcopal city. The cathedral is very beautiful, the pillars alternately Gothic and Corinthian. We entered a very noble parochial church. Noyon is walled, and is said to be 3 miles round. November 4, Saturday. We rose very early, and came through Saint-Quentin to Cambrai not long after 3. We went to an English nunnery to give a letter to Father Welch, the confessor, who came to visit us in the evening. November 5, Sunday. We saw the cathedral. It is very beautiful, with chapels on each side. The choir splendid. The balustrade in one part brass. The nef very high and grand. The altar silver, as far as it is seen. The vestments very splendid. At the Benedictines' church... Here his journal ends abruptly. Whether he wrote any more after this time I know not, but probably not much, as he arrived in England about the 12th of November. These short notes of his tour, though they may seem minute taken singly, make together a considerable mass of information, and exhibit such an ardour of inquiry and acuteness of examination, as, I believe, are found in but few travellers, especially at an advanced age. They completely refute the idle notion which has been propagated, that he could not see, and if he had taken the trouble to revise and digest them, he undoubtedly could have expanded them into a very entertaining narrative. When I met him in London the following year, the account which he gave me of his French tour was, "Sir, I have seen all the visibilities of Paris and around it, but to have formed an acquaintance with the people there would have required more time than I could stay. I was just beginning to creep into acquaintance by means of Colonel Drumgold, a very high man, sir, head of l'École Militaire, a most complete character, for he had first been a professor of rhetoric and then became a soldier. And, sir, I was very kindly treated by the English Benedictines, and have a cell appropriated to me in their convent." He observed, "The great in France live very magnificently, but the rest very miserably. There is no happy middle state as in England. The shops of Paris are mean. The meat in the markets is such as would be sent to a jail in England. And Mr. Thrale justly observed that the cookery of the French was forced upon them by necessity, for they could not eat their meat unless they added some taste to it. The French are an indelicate people. They will spit upon any place. At Madame Blank's, a literary lady of rank, the footman took the sugar in his fingers and threw it into my coffee. I was going to put it aside, but hearing it was made on purpose for me, I e'en tasted Tom's fingers. The same lady would needs make tea à l'angloise. The spout of the teapot did not pour freely. She bade the footman blow into it. France is worse than Scotland in everything but climate. Nature has done more for the French, but they have done less for themselves than the Scotch have done. It happened that Foote was at Paris at the same time with Dr. Johnson, and his description of my friend while there was abundantly ludicrous. He told me that the French were quite astonished at his figure and manner, and at his dress, which he obstinately continued exactly as in London, his brown clothes, black stockings, and plain shirt. He mentioned that an Irish gentleman said to Johnson, "Sir, you have not seen the best French players." Johnson: "Players, sir, I look on them as no better than creatures set upon tables and joint stools to make faces and produce laughter, like dancing dogs." "But, sir, you will allow that some players are better than others." Johnson: "Yes, sir, as some dogs dance better than others." While Johnson was in France, he was generally very resolute in speaking Latin. It was a maxim with him that a man should not let himself down by speaking a language which he speaks imperfectly. Indeed, we must have often observed how inferior, how much like a child a man appears who speaks a broken tongue. When Sir Joshua Reynolds, at one of the dinners of the Royal Academy, presented him to a Frenchman of great distinction, he would not deign to speak French, but talked Latin, though His Excellency did not understand it, owing perhaps to Johnson's English pronunciation. Yet upon another occasion he was observed to speak French to a Frenchman of high rank, who spoke English, and being asked the reason, with some expression of surprise, he answered, "Because I think my French is as good as his English." Though Johnson understood French perfectly, he could not speak it readily, as I have observed at his first interview with General Paoli in 1769. Yet he wrote it, I imagine, pretty well, as appears from some of his letters in Mrs. Piozzi's collection, of which I shall transcribe one. À Madame la Comtesse de Blanc, July 16, 1775. Oui, madame, le moment est arrivé, et il faut que je parte. Mais pourquoi faut-il partir? Est-ce que je m'ennuie? Je m'ennuierai ailleurs. Est-ce que je cherche quelque plaisir ou quelque soulagement? Je ne cherche rien. Je n'espère rien. Allez voir ce que j'ai vu. Être un peu rejoué, un peu dégoûté, me ressouvenir que la vie se passe en vain, me plaindre de moi, me durcir au dehors. Voilà tout de ce qu'on compte pour les délices de l'année. Que Dieu vous donne, madame, tous les agréments de la vie, avec un esprit qui peut en jouir sans s'y livrer trop. Here let me not forget a curious anecdote as related to me by Mr. Beauclerk, which I shall endeavour to exhibit as well as I can in that gentleman's lively manner. And in justice to him it is proper to add that Dr. Johnson told me I might rely both on the correctness of his memory and the fidelity of his narrative. When Madame de Boufflers was first in England, said Beauclerk, she was desirous to see Johnson. I accordingly went with her to his chambers in the Temple, where she was entertained with his conversation for some time. When our visit was over, she and I left him, and were got into Inner Temple Lane, when all at once I heard a noise like thunder. This was occasioned by Johnson, who, it seems, upon a little recollection, had taken it into his head that he ought to have done the honours of his literary residence to a foreign lady of quality, and eager to show himself a man of gallantry, was hurrying down the staircase in violent agitation. He overtook us before we reached the Temple gate, and brushing in between me and Madame de Boufflers, seized her hand and conducted her to her coach. His dress was a rusty brown morning suit, a pair of old shoes by way of slippers, a little shrivelled wig sticking on the top of his head, and the sleeves of his shirt and the knees of his breeches hanging loose. A considerable crowd of people gathered round, and were not a little struck by this singular appearance. He spoke Latin with wonderful fluency and elegance. When Père Boscovich was in England, Johnson dined in company with him at Sir Joshua Reynolds's and at Dr. Douglas's, now Bishop of Salisbury. Upon both occasions that celebrated foreigner expressed his astonishment at Johnson's Latin conversation. When at Paris, Johnson thus characterized Voltaire to Fréron the journalist: Ver est acerrimi ingeni et paucarum literarum. To Dr. Samuel Johnson, Edinburgh, December 5, 1775. My dear Sir, Mr. Alexander Maclean, the young Laird of Call, being to set out tomorrow for London, I give him this letter to introduce him to your acquaintance. The kindness which you and I experienced from his brother, whose unfortunate death we sincerely lament, will make us always desirous to show attention to any branch of the family. Indeed, you have so much of the true Highland cordiality that I am sure you would have thought me to blame if I had neglected to recommend to you this Hebridean prince, in whose island we were hospitably entertained. I ever am, with respectful attachment, my dear sir, your most obliged and most humble servant, James Boswell. Mr. Maclean returned with the most agreeable accounts of the polite attention with which he was received by Dr. Johnson. In the course of this year, Dr. Burney informs me that he very frequently met Dr. Johnson at Mr. Thrale's at Streatham, where they had many long conversations, often sitting up as long as the fire and candles lasted, and much longer than the patience of the servants subsisted. A few of Johnson's sayings, which that gentleman recollects, shall here be inserted. I never take a nap after dinner, but when I have had a bad night, and then the nap takes me. The writer of an epitaph should not be considered as saying nothing but what is strictly true. Allowance must be made for some degree of exaggerated praise. In lapidary inscriptions a man is not upon oath. There is now less flogging in our great schools than formerly, but then less is learned there, so that what the boys get at one end they lose at the other. More is learned in public than in private schools from emulation. There is the collision of mind with mind, or the radiation of many minds pointing to one centre. Though few boys make their own exercises, yet if a good exercise is given up out of a great number of boys, it is made by somebody. I hate byroads in education. Education is as well known, and has long been as well known, as ever it can be. Endeavouring to make children prematurely wise is useless labour. Suppose they have more knowledge at 5 or 6 years old than other children, what use can be made of it? It will be lost before it is wanted, and the waste of so much time and labour of the teacher can never be repaid. Too much is expected from precocity, and too little performed. Miss Blank was an instance of early cultivation, but in what did it terminate? In marrying a little Presbyterian parson, who keeps an infant boarding school, so that all her employment now is to suckle fools and chronicle small beer. She tells the children, this is a cat, and that is a dog, with 4 legs and a tail. See there, you are much better than a cat or a dog, for you can speak. If I had bestowed such an education on a daughter, and had discovered that she thought of marrying such a fellow, I would have sent her to the Congress. After having talked slightingly of music, he was observed to listen very attentively while Miss Thrale played on the harpsichord, and with eagerness he called to her, "Why don't you dash away like Burney?" Dr. Burney, upon this, said to him, "I believe, sir, we shall make a musician of you at last." Johnson, with candid complacency, replied, "Sir, I shall be glad to have a new sense given to me." He had come down one morning to the breakfast-room, and been a considerable time by himself before anybody appeared. When on a subsequent day he was twitted by Mrs. Thrale for being very late, which he generally was, he defended himself by alluding to the extraordinary morning when he had been too early. "Madam, I do not like to come down to vacuity." Dr. Burney, having remarked that Mr. Garrick was beginning to look old, he said, "Why, sir, you are not to wonder at that. No man's face has had more wear and tear." Not having heard from him for a longer time than I supposed he would be silent, I wrote to him December 18, not in good spirits. Sometimes I have been afraid that the cold which has gone over Europe this year like a sort of pestilence has seized you severely. Sometimes my imagination, which is upon occasions prolific of evil, hath figured that you may have somehow taken offence at some part of my conduct. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, never dream of any offence. How should you offend me? I consider your friendship as a possession, which I intend to hold till you take it from me, and to lament if ever by my fault I should lose it. However, when such suspicions find their way into your mind, always give them vent. I shall make haste to disperse them, but hinder their first ingress if you can. Consider such thoughts as morbid. Such illness as may excuse my omission to Lord Hailes, I cannot honestly plead. I have been hindered, I know not how, by a succession of petty obstructions. I hope to mend immediately, and to send next post to his lordship. Mr. Thrale would have written to you if I had omitted. He sends his compliments, and wishes to see you. You and your lady will now have no more wrangling about feudal inheritance. How does the young Laird of Auchinleck? I suppose Miss Veronica is grown a reader and discourser. I have just now got a cough, but it has never yet hindered me from sleeping. I have had quieter nights than are common with me. I cannot but rejoice that Joseph has had the wit to find the way back. He is a fine fellow and one of the best travellers in the world. Young Coll brought me your letter. He is a very pleasing youth. I took him 2 days ago to the Mitre, and we dined together. I was as civil as I had the means of being. I have had a letter from Rasay, acknowledging, with great appearance of satisfaction, the insertion in the Edinburgh paper. I am very glad that it was done. My compliments to Mrs. Boswell, who does not love me. And of all the rest, I need only send them to those that do, and I am afraid it will give you very little trouble to distribute them. I am, my dear, dear sir, your affectionate humble servant, Sam Johnson. December 23, 1775. End of section 19.
Section 20 of The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2, by James Boswell. Section 20. 1776, age 67. In 1776, Johnson wrote, so far as I can discover, nothing for the public, but that his mind was still ardent, and fraught with generous wishes to attain to still higher degrees of literary excellence, is proved by his private notes of this year, which I shall insert in their proper place. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, I have at last sent you all Lord Hailes's papers. While I was in France, I looked very often into Hainault, but Lord Hailes, in my opinion, leaves him far and far behind. Why I did not dispatch so short a perusal sooner, when I look back, I am utterly unable to discover, but human moments are stolen away by 1,000 petty impediments which leave no trace behind them. I have been afflicted, through the whole Christmas, with the general disorder, of which the worst effect was a cough, which is now much mitigated, though the country, on which I look from a window at Streatham, is now covered with a deep snow. Mrs. Williams is very ill. Everybody else is as usual. Among the papers I found a letter to you, which I think you had not opened, and a paper for the Chronicle, which I suppose it not necessary now to insert. I return them both. I have, within these few days, had the honour of receiving Lord Hailes's first volume, for which I return my most respectful thanks. I wish you, my dearest friend, and your haughty lady, for I know she does not love me, and the young ladies, and the young lord, all happiness. Teach the young gentleman, in spite of his mamma, to think and speak well of, Sir, your affectionate humble servant, Sam Johnson. January 10, 1776. At this time was in agitation a matter of great consequence to me and my family, which I should not obtrude upon the world, were it not that the part which Dr. Johnson's friendship for me made him take in it was the occasion of an exertion of his abilities which it would be injustice to conceal. That what he wrote upon the subject may be understood, it is necessary to give a state of the question, which I shall do as briefly as I can. In the year 1504, the barony or manor of Affleck, in Ayrshire, which belonged to a family of the same name, with the lands, having fallen to the crown by forfeiture, James IV, King of Scotland, granted it to Thomas Boswell, a branch of an ancient family in the county of Fife, styling him in the charter Dilecto familiari nostro, and assigning, as the cause of the grant, pro bono et fideli servitio nobis prestito. Thomas Boswell was slain in battle, fighting along with his sovereign at the fatal field of Flodden in 1513. From this very honourable founder of our family the estate was transmitted in a direct series of heirs male to David Boswell, my father's great-grand-uncle, who had no sons but 4 daughters, who were all respectably married, the eldest to Lord Cathcart. David Boswell, being resolute in the military feudal principle of continuing the male succession, passed by his daughters and settled the estate on his nephew by his next brother, who approved of the deed, and renounced any pretensions which he might possibly have in preference to his son. But the estate having been burthened with large portions to the daughters and other debts, it was necessary for the nephew to sell a considerable part of it, and what remained was still much encumbered. The frugality of the nephew preserved and in some degree relieved the estate. His son, my grandfather, an eminent lawyer, not only repurchased a great part of what had been sold, but acquired other lands, and my father, who was one of the judges of Scotland and had added considerably to the estate, now signified his inclination to take the privilege allowed by our law to secure it to his family in perpetuity by an entail which, on account of his marriage articles, could not be done without my consent. In the plan of entailing the estate I heartily concurred with him, though I was the first to be restrained by it. But we unhappily differed as to the series of heirs which should be established, or in the language of our law, called to the succession. My father had declared a predilection for heirs general, that is, males and females indiscriminately. He was willing, however, that all males descending from his grandfather should be preferred to females, but would not extend that privilege to males deriving their descent from a higher source. I, on the other hand, had a zealous partiality for heirs male, however remote, which I maintained by arguments which appeared to me to have considerable weight. And in the particular case of our family, I apprehended that we were under an implied obligation, in honour and good faith, to transmit the estate by the same tenure which we held it, which was as heirs male, excluding nearer females. I therefore, as I thought conscientiously, objected to my father's scheme. My opposition was very displeasing to my father, who was entitled to great respect and deference, and I had reason to apprehend disagreeable consequences from my non-compliance with his wishes. After much perplexity and uneasiness, I wrote to Dr. Johnson, stating the case, with all its difficulties, at full length, and earnestly requesting that he would consider it at leisure, and favour me with his friendly opinion and advice. To James Boswell, Esq. Dear Sir, I was much impressed by your letter, and if I can form upon your case any resolution satisfactory to myself, will very gladly impart it. But whether I am quite equal to it I do not know. It is a case compounded of law and justice, and requires a mind versed in juridical disquisitions. Could not you tell your whole mind to Lord Hailes? He is, you know, both a Christian and a lawyer. I suppose he is above partiality and above loquacity, and, I believe, he will not think the time lost in which he may quiet a disturbed or settle a wavering mind. Write to me as anything occurs to you, and if I find myself stopped by want of facts necessary to be known, I will make enquiries of you as my doubts arise. If your former resolutions should be found only fanciful, you decide rightly in judging that your father's fancies may claim the preference. But whether they are fanciful or rational is the question. I really think Lord Hailes could help us. Make my compliments to dear Mrs. Boswell, and tell her that I hope to be wanting in nothing that I can contribute to bring you all out of your troubles. I am, dear Sir, most affectionately, your humble servant, Sam Johnson. London, January 15, 1776. To the same. Dear Sir, I am going to write upon a question which requires more knowledge of local law and more acquaintance with the general rules of inheritance than I can claim, but I write because you request it. Land is, like any other possession, by natural right wholly in the power of its present owner, and may be sold, given, or bequeathed, absolutely or conditionally, as judgment shall direct, or passion incite. But natural right would avail little without the protection of law, and the primary notion of law is restraint in the exercise of natural right. A man is therefore, in society, not fully master of what he calls his own, but he still retains all the power which law does not take from him. In the exercise of the right which law either leaves or gives, regard is to be paid to moral obligations. Of the estate which we are now considering, your father still retains such possession, with such power over it, that he can sell it, and do with the money what he will, without any legal impediment. But when he extends his power beyond his own life, by settling the order of succession, the law makes your consent necessary. Let us suppose that he sells the land to risk the money in some specious adventure, and in that adventure loses the whole. His posterity would be disappointed, but they could not think themselves injured or robbed. If he spent it upon vice or pleasure, his successors could only call him vicious and voluptuous, they could not say that he was injurious or unjust. He that may do more may do less. He that by selling or squandering may disinherit a whole family, may certainly disinherit part by a partial settlement. Laws are formed by the manners and exigencies of particular times, and it is but accidental that they last longer than their causes. The limitation of feudal succession to the male arose from the obligation of the tenant to attend his chief in war. As times and opinions are always changing, I know not whether it be not usurpation to prescribe rules to posterity by presuming to judge of what we cannot know. And I know not whether I fully approve either your design or your father's, to limit that succession which descended to you unlimited. If we are to leave sartum tectum to posterity, what we have without any merit of our own received from our ancestors, should not choice and free will be kept unviolated? Is land to be treated with more reverence than liberty? If this consideration should restrain your father from disinheriting some of the males, does it leave you the power of disinheriting all the females? Can the possessor of a feudal estate make any will? Can he appoint out of the inheritance any portions to his daughters? There seems to be a very shadowy difference between the power of leaving land and of leaving money to be raised from land, between leaving an estate to females and leaving the male heir in effect only their steward. Suppose at one time a law that allowed only males to inherit, and during the continuance of this law many estates to have descended, passing by the females, to remoter heirs. Suppose afterwards the law repealed in correspondence with the change of manners, and women made capable of inheritance, would not then the tenure of estates be changed? Could the women have no benefit from a law made in their favour? Must they be passed by upon moral principles for ever, because they were once excluded by a legal prohibition? Or may that which passed only to males by one law pass likewise to females by another? You mention your resolution to maintain the right of your brothers. I do not see how any of their rights are invaded. as your whole difficulty arises from the act of your ancestor who diverted the succession from the females, you inquire, very properly, what were his motives, and what was his intention. For you certainly are not bound by his act more than he intended to bind you, nor hold your land on harder or stricter terms than those on which it was granted. Intentions must be gathered from acts. When he left the estate to his nephew by excluding his daughters, was it or was it not in his power to have perpetuated the succession to the males? If he could have done it, he seems to have shown by omitting it that he did not desire it to be done, and, upon your own principles, you will not easily prove your right to destroy that capacity of succession which your ancestors have left. If your ancestor had not the power of making a perpetual settlement, and if, therefore, we cannot judge distinctly of his intentions, yet his act can only be considered as an example, it makes not an obligation. And, as you observe, he set no example of rigorous adherence to the line of succession. He that overlooked a brother would not wonder that little regard is shown to remote relations. As the rules of succession are, in a great part, purely legal, no man can be supposed to bequeath anything but upon legal terms. He can grant no power which the law denies, and if he makes no special and definite limitation, he confers all the power which the law allows. Your ancestor, for some reason, disinherited his daughters, but it no more follows that he intended this act as a rule for posterity than the disinheriting of his brother. If, therefore, you ask by what right your father admits daughters to inheritance, ask yourself first by what right you require them to be excluded. It appears, upon reflection, that your father excludes nobody. He only admits nearer females to inherit before males more remote, and the exclusion is purely consequential. These, dear sir, are my thoughts, immethodical and deliberative, but perhaps you may find in them some glimmering of evidence. I cannot, however, but again recommend to you a conference with Lord Hailes, whom you know to be both a lawyer and a Christian. Make my compliments to Mrs. Boswell, though she does not love me. I am, sir, your affectionate servant, Sam Johnson. February 3rd, 1773. I had followed his recommendation and consulted Lord Hailes, who upon this subject had a firm opinion contrary to mine. His lordship obligingly took the trouble to write me a letter, in which he discussed with legal and historical learning the points in which I saw much difficulty, maintaining that, "the succession of heirs general was the succession, by the law of Scotland, from the throne to the cottage, as far as we can learn it by record," observing that the estate of our family had not been limited to heirs male, and that though an heir male had in one instance been chosen in preference to nearer females, that had been an arbitrary act, which had seemed to be best in the embarrassed state of affairs at that time, and the fact was that upon a fair computation of the value of land and money at the time applied to the estate and the burdens upon it, there was nothing given to the heir male but the skeleton of an estate. "The plea of conscience," said his lordship, "which you put, is a most respectable one, especially when conscience and self are on different sides. But I think that conscience is not well informed, and that self and she ought on this occasion to be of a side." This letter, which had considerable influence upon my mind, I sent to Dr. Johnson, begging to hear from him again upon this interesting question. To James Boswell, Esq. Dear Sir, having not any acquaintance with the laws or customs of Scotland, I endeavoured to consider your question upon general principles, and found nothing of much validity that I could oppose to this position. "He who inherits a fief unlimited by his ancestors, inherits the power of limiting it according to his own judgment or opinion." If this be true, you may join with your father. Further consideration produces another conclusion. "He who receives a fief unlimited by his ancestors gives his heirs some reason to complain if he does not transmit it unlimited to posterity. For why should he make the state of others worse than his own without a reason?" If this be true, though neither you nor your father are about to do what is quite right, but as your father violates, I think, the legal succession least, he seems to be nearer the right than yourself. It cannot but occur that, Women have natural and equitable claims as well as men, and these claims are not to be capriciously or lightly superseded or infringed." When fiefs implied military service, it is easily discerned why females could not inherit them, but that reason is now at an end. As manners make laws, manners likewise repeal them. These are the general conclusions which I have attained. None of them are very favourable to your scheme of entail, nor perhaps to any scheme. My observation that only he who acquires an estate may bequeath it capriciously, if it contains any conviction, includes this position likewise, that only he who acquires an estate may entail it capriciously. But I think it may be safely presumed that "he who inherits an estate inherits all the power legally concomitant," and that "he who gives or leaves unlimited an estate legally limitable must be presumed to give that power of limitation which he omitted to take away, and to commit further contingencies to future prudence." In these two positions I believe Lord Hailes will advise you to rest. Every other notion of possession seems to me full of difficulties and embarrassed with scruples. If these axioms be allowed, you have arrived now at full liberty without the help of particular circumstances, which, however, have in your case great weight. You very rightly observe that he who passing by his brother gave the inheritance to his nephew could limit no more than he gave, and by Lord Hailes's estimate of 14 years' purchase, what he gave was no more than you may easily entail, according to your own opinion, if that opinion should finally prevail. Lord Hailes's suspicion that entails are encroachments on the dominion of Providence may be extended to all hereditary privileges and all permanent institutions. I do not see why it may not be extended to any provision for the present hour, since all care about futurity proceeds upon a supposition that we know at least in some degree what will be future. Of the future we certainly know nothing, but we may form conjectures from the past, and the power of forming conjectures includes, in my opinion, the duty of acting in conformity to that probability which we discover. Providence gives the power, of which reason teaches the use. I am, dear Sir, your most faithful servant, Sam Johnson. February 9th, 1776. I hope I shall get some ground now with Mrs. Boswell. Make my compliments to her and to the little people. Don't burn papers, they may be safe enough in your own box. You will wish to see them hereafter. To the same. Dear Sir, to the letters which I have written about your great question I have nothing to add. If your conscience is satisfied, you have now only your prudence to consult. I long for a letter, that I may know how this troublesome and vexatious question is at last decided. I hope that it will at last end well. Lord Hailes's letter was very friendly, and very seasonable, but I think his aversion from entails has something in it like superstition. Providence is not counteracted by any means which Providence puts into our power. The continuance and propagation of families makes a great part of the Jewish law, and is by no means prohibited in the Christian institution, though the necessity of it continues no longer. Hereditary tenures are established in all civilized countries, and are accompanied in most with hereditary authority. Sir William Temple considers our constitution as defective, that there is not an unalienable estate in land connected with a peerage, and Lord Bacon mentions as a proof that the Turks are barbarians their want of stirps, as he calls them, or hereditary rank. Do not let your mind, when it is freed from the supposed necessity of a rigorous entail, be entangled with contrary objections, and think all entails unlawful, till you have cogent arguments, which I believe you will never find. I am afraid of scruples. I have now sent all Lord Hailes's papers. Part I found hidden in a drawer in which I had laid them for security, and had forgotten them. Part of these are written twice. I have returned both the copies. Part I had read before. Be so kind as to return Lord Hailes my most respectful thanks for his first volume. His accuracy strikes me with wonder. His narrative is far superior to that of Hainaut, as I formerly mentioned. I am afraid that the trouble, which my irregularity and delay has cost him, is greater, far greater, than any good that I can do him will ever recompense, but if I have any more copy, I will try to do better. Pray let me know if Mrs. Boswell is friends with me, and pay my respects to Veronica and Euphemia and Alexander. I am, Sir, your most humble servant, Sam Johnson. February 15, 1776. Mr. Boswell to Dr. Johnson. Edinburgh, February 20th, 1776. You have illuminated my mind and relieved me from imaginary shackles of conscientious obligation. Were it necessary, I could immediately join in an entail upon the series of heirs approved by my father, but it is better not to act too suddenly. Dr. Johnson to Mr. Boswell. Dear Sir, I am glad that what I could think or say has at all contributed to quiet your thoughts. Your resolution not to act till your opinion is confirmed by more deliberation is very just. If you have been scrupulous, do not now be rash. I hope that as you think more and take opportunities of talking with men intelligent in questions of property, you will be able to free yourself from every difficulty. When I wrote last, I sent, I think, 10 packets. Did you receive them all? You must tell Mrs. Boswell that I suspected her to have written without your knowledge, and therefore did not return any answer, lest the clandestine correspondence should have been perniciously discovered. I will write to her soon. I am, dear Sir, most affectionately yours, Sam Johnson. February 24th, 1776. Having communicated to Lord Hailes what Dr. Johnson wrote concerning the question which perplexed me so much, his lordship wrote to me, "Your scruples have produced more fruit than I ever expected from them. An excellent dissertation on general principles of morals and law." I wrote to Dr. Johnson on the 20th of February, complaining of melancholy, and expressing a strong desire to be with him, informing him that the 10 packets came all safe, that Lord Hailes was much obliged to him, and said he had almost wholly removed his scruples against entails. To James Boswell, Esq. Dear Sir, I have not had your letter half an hour. As you lay so much weight upon my notions, I should think it not just to delay my answer. I am very sorry that your melancholy should return, and should be sorry likewise if it could have no relief but from company. My counsel you may have, when you are pleased to require it, but of my company you cannot in the next month have much, for Mr. Thrale will take me to Italy, he says, on the 1st of April. Let me warn you very earnestly against scruples. I am glad that you are reconciled to your settlement, and think it a great honour to have shaken Lord Hailes's opinion of entails. Do not, however, hope wholly to reason away your troubles. Do not feed them with intention, and they will die imperceptibly away. Fix your thoughts upon your business, fill your intervals with company, and sunshine will again break in upon your mind. If you will come to me, you must come very quickly, and even then I know not but we may scour the country together, for I have a mind to see Oxford and Lichfield before I set out on this long journey. To this I can only add that I am, dear Sir, your most affectionate humble servant, Sam Johnson, March the 5th, 1776. To the same. Dear Sir, very early in April we leave England, and in the beginning of the next week I shall leave London for a short time. Of this I think it necessary to inform you, that you may not be disappointed in any of your enterprises. I had not fully resolved to go into the country before this day. Please to make my compliments to Lord Hailes, and mention very particularly to Mrs. Boswell my hope that she is reconciled to, Sir, your faithful servant, Sam Johnson, March 12, 1776. Above 30 years ago, the heirs of Lord Chancellor Clarendon presented the University of Oxford with a continuation of his History, and such other of his Lordship's manuscripts as had not been published, on condition that the profits arising from their publication should be applied to the establishment of a manege in the University. The gift was accepted in full convocation. A person being now recommended to Dr. Johnson as fit to superintend this proposed riding school, he exerted himself with that zeal for which he was remarkable upon every similar occasion. But on inquiry into the matter he found that the scheme was not likely to be soon carried into execution, the profits arising from the Clarendon press being, from some mismanagement, very scanty. This having been explained to him by a respectable dignitary of the Church, who had good means of knowing it, he wrote a letter upon the subject, which at once exhibits his extraordinary precision and acuteness, and his warm attachment to his alma mater. To the Reverend Dr. Wetherell, Master of University College, Oxford. Dear Sir, Few things are more unpleasant than the transaction of business with men who are above knowing or caring what they have to do, such as the trustees for Lord Cornbury's institution will, perhaps, appear when you have read Dr. 's letter. The last part of the doctor's letter is of great importance. The complaint which he makes I have heard long ago, and did not know but it was redressed. It is unhappy that a practice so erroneous has not yet been altered, for altered it must be, or our press will be useless, with all its privileges. The booksellers who, like all other men, have strong prejudices in their own favour, are enough inclined to think the practice of printing and selling books by any but themselves an encroachment on the rights of their fraternity, and have need of stronger inducements to circulate academical publications than those of one another. For of that mutual cooperation by which the general trade is carried on, the University can bear no part. Of those whom he neither loves nor fears, and from whom he expects no reciprocation of good offices, why should any man promote the interest but for profit? I suppose, with all our scholastic ignorance of mankind, we are still too knowing to expect that the booksellers will erect themselves into patrons, and buy and sell under the influence of a disinterested zeal for the promotion of learning. To the booksellers, if we look for either honour or profit from our press, not only their common profit, but something more must be allowed, and if books printed at Oxford are expected to be rated at a high price, that price must be levied on the public, and paid by the ultimate purchaser, not by the intermediate agents. What price shall be set upon the book is, to the booksellers, wholly indifferent, provided that they gain a proportionate profit by negotiating the sale. Why books printed at Oxford should be particularly dear, I am, however, unable to find. We pay no rent, we inherit many of our instruments and materials, lodging and victuals are cheaper than at London, and therefore workmanship ought at least not to be dearer. Our expenses are naturally less than those of booksellers, and, in most cases, communities are content with less profit than individuals. It is perhaps not considered through how many hands a book often passes before it comes into those of the reader, or what part of the profit each hand must retain as a motive for transmitting it to the next. We will call our primary agent in London Mr. Cadell, who receives our books from us, gives them room in his warehouse, and issues them on demand. By him they are sold to Mr. Dilly, a wholesale bookseller, who sends them into the country, and the last seller is the country bookseller. Here are three profits to be paid between the printer and the reader, or in the style of commerce, between the manufacturer and the consumer, and if any of these profits is too penuriously distributed, the process of commerce is interrupted. We are now come to the practical question, what is to be done? You will tell me, with reason, that I have said nothing till I declare how much, according to my opinion, of the ultimate price ought to be distributed through the whole succession of sale. The deduction, I am afraid, will appear very great, but let it be considered before it is refused. We must allow for profit between 30 and 35%, between 6 and 7 shillings in the pound, that is, for every book which cost the last buyer 20 shillings, we must charge Mr. Cadell with something less than 14. We must set the copies at 14 shillings each, and superadd what is called the quarterly book, or for every 100 books so charged we must deliver 104. The profits will then stand thus: Mr. Cadell, who runs no hazard and gives no credit, will be paid for warehouse room and attendance by a shilling profit on each book, and his chance of the quarterly book. Mr. Dilly, who buys the book for 15 shillings, and who will expect the quarterly book if he takes 25, will send it to his country customer at 16 6, by which, at the hazard of loss and the certainty of long credit, he gains the regular profit of 10%, which is expected in the wholesale trade. The country bookseller, buying at 16 6, and commonly trusting a considerable time, gains but 3 6, and if he trusts a year, not much more than 2 6, otherwise than as he may perhaps take as long credit as he gives. With less profit than this, and more you see he cannot have, the country bookseller cannot live, for his receipts are small, and his debts sometimes bad. Thus, dear Sir, I have been incited by Dr. 's letter to give you a detail of the circulation of books which, perhaps, every man has not had opportunity of knowing, and which those who know it do not perhaps always distinctly consider. I am, etc., Sam Johnson, March the 12th, 1776. End of section 20.
Section 21 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2, by James Boswell. Section 21, 1776, continued. Having arrived in London late on Friday, the 15th of March, I hastened next morning to wait on Dr. Johnson, at his house, but found he was removed from Johnson's Court, No. 7, to Bolt Court, No. 8, still keeping to his favourite Fleet Street. My reflection at the time upon this change, as marked in my journal, is as follows. I felt a foolish regret that he had left a court which bore his name, to be affected with some tenderness of regard for a place in which I had seen him a great deal, from whence I had often issued a better and happier man than when I went in, and which had often appeared to my imagination, while I trod its pavements in the solemn darkness of the night, to be sacred to wisdom and piety. Being informed that he was at Mr. Thrale's in the Borough, I hastened thither, and found Mrs. Thrale and him at breakfast. I was kindly welcomed. In a moment he was in a full glow of conversation, and I felt myself elevated as if brought into another state of being. Mrs. Thrale and I looked to each other while he talked, and our looks expressed our congenial admiration and affection for him. I shall ever recollect this scene with great pleasure. I exclaimed to her, I am now intellectually hermipus redivivus. I am quite restored by him by transfusion of mind. There are many, she replied, who admire and respect Mr. Johnson, but you and I love him. He seemed very happy in the near prospect of going to Italy with Mr. and Mrs. Thrale. But, said he, before leaving England, I am to take a jaunt to Oxford, Birmingham, my native city Lichfield, and my old friend, Dr. Taylor's, at Ashbourne, in Derbyshire. I shall go in a few days, and you, Boswell, shall go with me. I was ready to accompany him, being willing even to leave London to have the pleasure of his conversation. I mentioned with much regret the extravagance of the representative of a great family in Scotland, by which there was danger of its being ruined; and as Johnson respected it for its antiquity, he joined with me in thinking it would be happy if this person should die. Mrs. Thrale seemed shocked at this, as feudal barbarity, and said, I do not understand this preference of the estate to its owner, of the land to the man who walks upon the land. Johnson. Nay, madam, it is not a preference of the land to its owner. It is the preference of a family to an individual. Here is an establishment in a country which is of importance for ages, not only to the chief but to his people, an establishment which extends upwards and downwards. That this should be destroyed by one idle fellow is a sad thing. He said, entails are good, because it is good to preserve in a country series of men, to whom the people are accustomed to look up, as to their leaders. But I am for leaving a quantity of land in commerce to excite industry and keep money in the country, for if no land were to be bought in the country, there would be no encouragement to acquire wealth, because a family could not be founded there, or if it were acquired, it must be carried away to another country where land may be bought. And although the lands in every country will remain the same, and be as fertile where there is no money as where there is, yet all that portion of the happiness of civil life which is produced by money circulating in a country would be lost. Boswell. Then, sir, would it be for the advantage of a country that all its lands were sold at once? Johnson. So far, sir, as money produces good, it would be an advantage. For, then that country would have as much money circulating in it as it is worth. But to be sure, this would be counterbalanced by disadvantages attending a total change of proprietors. I expressed my opinion that the power of entailing should be limited thus: that there should be 1/3, or perhaps 1/2 of the lands of a country kept free for commerce, that the proportion allowed to be entailed should be parcelled out so that no family could entail above a certain quantity. Let a family, according to the abilities of its representatives, be richer or poorer in different generations, or always rich if its representatives be always wise, but let its absolute permanency be moderate. In this way, we should be certain of there being always a number of established roots, and as in the course of nature there is in every age an extinction of some families, there would be continual openings for men ambitious of perpetuity, to plant a stock in the entail grounds. Johnson. Why, sir, mankind would be better able to regulate the system of entails, when the evil of too much land being locked up by them is felt, than we can do at present, when it is not felt. I mentioned Dr. Adam Smith's book on the Wealth of Nations, which was just published, and that Sir John Pringle had observed to me, that Dr. Smith, who had never been in trade, could not be expected to write well on that subject any more than a lawyer upon physic. Johnson. He is mistaken, sir. A man who has never been engaged in trade himself may undoubtedly write well upon trade, and there is nothing which requires more to be illustrated by philosophy than trade does. As to mere wealth, that is to say, money, it is clear that one nation or one individual cannot increase its store but by making another poorer. But trade procures what is more valuable, the reciprocation of the peculiar advantages of different countries. A merchant seldom thinks but of his own particular trade. To write a good book upon it, a man must have extensive views. It is not necessary to have practised to write well upon a subject. I mentioned law as a subject on which no man could write well without practice. Johnson. Why, sir, in England, where so much money is to be got by the practice of the law, most of our writers upon it have been in practice, though Blackstone had not been much in practice when he published his commentaries. But upon the continent, the great writers of law have not all been in practice. Grotius, indeed, was, but Puffendorf was not. Burlamaqui was not. When we had talked of the great consequence which a man acquired by being employed in his profession, I suggested a doubt of the justice of the general opinion that it is improper for a lawyer to solicit employment. For why, I urged, should it not be equally allowable to solicit that, as the means of consequence, as it is to solicit votes to be elected a member of Parliament? Mr. Strahan had told me that a countryman of his and mine, who had risen to eminence in the law, had, when first making his way, solicited him to get him employed in city causes. Johnson. Sir, it is wrong to stir up lawsuits, but when once it is certain that a lawsuit is to go on, there is nothing wrong in a lawyer's endeavouring that he shall have the benefit, rather than another. Boswell. You would not solicit employment, sir, if you were a lawyer. Johnson. No, sir, but not because I should think it wrong, but because I should disdain it. This was a good distinction, which will be felt by men of just pride. He proceeded, however, I would not have a lawyer to be wanting to himself in using fair means. I would have him to inject a little hint now and then, to prevent his being overlooked. Lord Mountstuart's bill for a Scotch militia, in supporting which his lordship had made an able speech in the House of Commons, was now a pretty general topic of conversation. Johnson. As Scotland contributes so little land tax towards the general support of the nation, it ought not to have a militia paid out of the general fund, unless it should be thought, for the general interest, that Scotland should be protected from an invasion, which no man can think will happen, for what enemy would invade Scotland where there is nothing to be got? No, sir. Now that the Scotch have not the pay of English soldiers spent among them, as so many troops are sent abroad, they are trying to get money another way, by having a militia paid. If they are afraid and seriously desire to have an armed force to defend them, they should pay for it. Your scheme is to retain a part of your land tax by making us pay and clothe your militia. Boswell. You should not talk of we and you, sir. There is now a union. Johnson. There must be a distinction of interest, while the proportions of land tax are so unequal. If Yorkshire should say, instead of paying our land tax, we will keep a greater number of militia, it would be unreasonable. In this argument, my friend was certainly in the wrong. The land tax is as unequally proportioned between different parts of England as between England and Scotland. Nay, it is considerably unequal in Scotland itself. But the land tax is but a small part of the numerous branches of public revenue, all of which Scotland pays precisely as England does. A French invasion made in Scotland would soon penetrate into England. He thus discoursed upon supposed obligation in settling estates. Where a man gets the unlimited property of an estate, there is no obligation upon him in justice to leave it to one person rather than to another. There is a motive of preference from kindness, and this kindness is generally entertained for the nearest relation. If I owe a particular man a sum of money, I am obliged to let that man have the next money I get, and cannot in justice let another have it. But if I owe money to no man, I may dispose of what I get as I please. There is not a dedium justitia to a man's next heir. There is only a dedium caritatis. It is plain, then, that I have morally a choice, according to my liking. If I have a brother in want, he has a claim from affection to my assistance. But if I have also a brother in want, whom I like better, he has a preferable claim. The right of an heir at law is only this, that he is to have the succession to an estate in case no other person is appointed to it by the owner. His right is merely preferable to that of the king. We got into a boat to cross over to Blackfriars, and as we moved along the Thames, I talked to him of a little volume which, altogether unknown to him, was advertised to be published in a few days, under the title of Johnsoniana, or Bon Mots of Dr. Johnson. Johnson. Sir, it is a mighty impudent thing. Boswell. Pray, sir, could you have no redress if you were to prosecute a publisher for bringing out, under your name, what you never said, and ascribing to you dull, stupid nonsense, or making you swear profanely, as many ignorant relaters of your bon mots do? Johnson. No, sir. There will always be some truth mixed with a falsehood, and how can it be ascertained how much is true and how much is false? Besides, sir, what damage would a jury give me for having been represented as swearing? Boswell. I think, sir, you should at least disavow such a publication, because the world and posterity might with much plausible foundation say, here is a volume which was publicly advertised and came out in Dr. Johnson's own time, and, by his silence, was admitted by him to be genuine. Johnson. I shall give myself no trouble about the matter. He was perhaps above suffering from such spurious publications, but I could not help thinking that many men would be much injured in their reputation by having absurd and vicious sayings imputed to them, and that redress ought in such cases to be given. He said, the value of every story depends on its being true. A story is a picture either of an individual or of human nature in general. If it be false, it is a picture of nothing. For instance, suppose a man should tell that Johnson, before setting out for Italy, as he had to cross the Alps, sat down to make himself wings. This many people would believe, but it would be a picture of nothing. Blank, naming a worthy friend of ours, used to think a story, till I showed him that truth was essential to it. I observed that Foote entertained us with stories which were not true, but that, indeed, it was properly not as narratives that Foote's stories pleased us, but as collections of ludicrous images. Johnson. Foote is quite impartial, for he tells lies of everybody. The importance of strict and scrupulous veracity cannot be too often inculcated. Johnson was known to be so rigidly attentive to it, that even in his common conversation the slightest circumstance was mentioned with exact precision. The knowledge of his having such a principle and habit made his friends have a perfect reliance on the truth of everything that he told, however it might have been doubted if told by many others. As an instance of this, I may mention an odd incident which he related as having happened to him one night in Fleet Street. A gentlewoman, said he, begged I would give her my arm to assist her in crossing the street, which I accordingly did, upon which she offered me a shilling, supposing me to be the watchman. I perceived that she was somewhat in liquor. This, if told by most people, would have been thought an invention. When told by Johnson, it was believed by his friends, as much as if they had seen what passed. We landed at the Temple stairs, where we parted. I found him, in the evening, in Mrs. Williams' room. We talked of religious orders. He said, "It is as unreasonable for a man to go into a Carthusian convent for fear of being immoral, as for a man to cut off his hands for fear he should steal. There is indeed great resolution in the immediate act of dismembering himself, but when that is once done, he has no longer any merit. For though he is out of his power to steal, yet he may all his life be a thief in his heart. So when a man has once become a Carthusian, he is obliged to continue so, whether he chooses it or not. Their silence, too, is absurd. We read in the Gospel of the Apostles being sent to preach, but not to hold their tongues. All severity that does not tend to increase good or prevent evil is idle. I said to the lady abbess of a convent, 'Madam, you are here, not for the love of virtue, but the fear of vice.' She said, she should remember this as long as she lived. I thought it hard to give her this view of her situation when she could not help it, and indeed I wondered at the whole of what he now said, because both in his Rambler and Idler he treats religious austerities with much solemnity and respect. Finding him still persevering in his abstinence from wine, I ventured to speak to him of it. Johnson: "Sir, I have no objection to a man's drinking wine, if he can do it in moderation. I found myself apt to go to excess in it, and therefore, after having been for some time without it, on occasion of illness, I thought it better not to return to it. Every man is to judge for himself, according to the effects which he experiences. One of the fathers tells us, he found fasting made him so peevish that he did not practice it. Though he often enlarged upon the evil of intoxication, he was by no means harsh and unforgiving to those who indulged in occasional excess in wine. One of his friends, I well remember, came to sup at a tavern with him and some other gentlemen, and too plainly discovered that he had drunk too much at dinner. When one who loved mischief, thinking to produce a severe censure, asked Johnson, a few days afterwards, 'Well, sir, what did your friend say to you as an apology for being in such a situation?' Johnson answered, 'Sir, he said all that a man should say. He said he was sorry for it.' I heard him once give a very judicious practical advice upon this subject. A man who has been drinking wine at all freely should never go into a new company. With those who have partaken of wine with him, he may be pretty well in unison, but he will probably be offensive, or appear ridiculous, to other people. He allowed very great influence to education. I do not deny, sir, but there is some original difference in minds, but it is nothing in comparison of what is formed by education. We may instance the science of numbers, which all minds are equally capable of attaining, yet we find a prodigious difference in the powers of different men, in that respect, after they are grown up, because their minds have been more or less exercised in it, and I think the same cause will explain the difference of excellence in other things, gradations admitting always some difference in the first principles. This is a difficult subject. but it is best to hope that diligence may do a great deal. We are sure of what it can do in increasing our mechanical force and dexterity. I again visited him on Monday. He took occasion to enlarge, as he often did, upon the wretchedness of a sea life. A ship is worse than a jail. There is, in a jail, better air, better company, better conveniency of every kind, and a ship has the additional disadvantage of being in danger. When men come to like a sea life, they are not fit to live on land. Then, said I, it would be cruel in a father to breed his son to the sea. Johnson, it would be cruel in a father who thinks as I do. Men go to sea before they know the unhappiness of that way of life, and when they have come to know it, they cannot escape from it, because it is then too late to choose another profession, as indeed is generally the case with men when they have once engaged in any particular way of life. On Tuesday, March 19th, which was fixed for our proposed jaunt, we met in the morning at the Somerset Coffee House in the Strand, where we were taken up by the Oxford coach. He was accompanied by Mr. Gwyn, the architect, and a gentleman of Merton College, whom we did not know, had the fourth seat. We soon got into conversation, for it was very remarkable of Johnson that the presence of a stranger had no restraint upon his talk. I observed that Garrick, who was about to quit the stage, would soon have an easier life. Johnson, I doubt that, sir. Boswell, why, sir, he will be Atlas with a burden off his back. Johnson, but I know not, sir, if he will be so steady without his load. However, he should never play any more, but be entirely the gentleman, and not partly the player. He should no longer subject himself to be hissed by a mob, or to be insolently treated by performers, whom he used to rule with a high hand, and who would gladly retaliate. Boswell, I think he should play once a year for the benefit of decayed actors, as it has been said he means to do so. Johnson, alas, sir, he will soon be a decayed actor himself. Johnson expressed his disapprobation of ornamental architecture, such as magnificent columns supporting a portico, or expensive pilasters supporting merely their own capitals, because it consumes labor disproportionate to its utility. For the same reason, he satirized statuary. Painting, said he, consumes labor not disproportionate to its effect, but a fellow will hack half a year at a block of marble to make something in stone that hardly resembles a man. The value of statuary is owing to its difficulty. You would not value the finest head cut upon a carrot. Here he seemed to me to be strangely deficient in taste, for surely statuary is a noble art of imitation, and preserves a wonderful expression of the varieties of the human frame. And although it must be allowed that the circumstances of difficulty enhance the value of a marble head, we should consider that if it requires a long time in the performance, it has a proportionate value in durability. Gwyn was a fine, lively, rattling fellow. Dr. Johnson kept him in subjection, but with a kindly authority. The spirit of the artist, however, rose against what he thought a Gothic attack, and he made a brisk defense. What, sir, will you allow no value to beauty in architecture or in statuary? Why should we allow it then in writing? Why do you take the trouble to give us so many fine allusions, and bright images and elegant phrases? You might convey all your instruction without these ornaments. Johnson smiled with complacency, but said, Why, sir, all these ornaments are useful, because they obtain an easier reception for truth. But a building is not at all more convenient for being decorated with superfluous carved work. Gwyn was at last lucky enough to make one reply to Dr. Johnson, which he allowed to be excellent. Johnson censured him for taking down a church which might have stood many years, and building a new one at a different place, for no other reason but that there might be a direct road to a new bridge, and his expression was, You are taking a church out of the way that the people may go in a straight line to the bridge." "No, sir," said Gwyn. "I am putting the church in the way that the people may not go out of the way." Johnson, with a hearty loud laugh of approbation: "Speak no more. Rest your colloquial fame upon this." Upon our arrival at Oxford, Dr. Johnson and I went directly to University College, but were disappointed on finding that one of the fellows, his friend Mr. Scott, who accompanied him from Newcastle to Edinburgh, was gone to the country. We put up at the Angel Inn, and passed the evening by ourselves, in easy and familiar conversation. Talking of constitutional melancholy, he observed, "A man so afflicted, sir, must avert distressing thoughts, and not combat with them." Boswell: "May he not think them down, sir?" Johnson: "No, sir. To attempt to think them down is madness. He should have a lamp constantly burning in his bedchamber during the night, and if wakefully disturbed, take a book, and read and compose himself to rest. To have the management of the mind is a great art, and it may be attained in a considerable degree by experience and habitual exercise." Boswell: "Should not he provide amusements for himself? Would it not, for instance, be right for him to take a course of chemistry?" Johnson: "Let him take a course of chemistry, or a course of rope dancing, or a course of anything to which he is inclined at the time. Let him contrive to have as many retreats for his mind as he can, as many things to which it can fly from itself." Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy is a valuable work. It is, perhaps, overloaded with quotation, but there is great spirit and great power in what Burton says when he writes from his own mind. Next morning we visited Dr. Wetherell, Master of University College, with whom Dr. Johnson conferred on the most advantageous mode of disposing of the books printed at the Clarendon Press, on which subject his letter had been inserted in a former page. I often had occasion to remark, Johnson loved business, loved to have his wisdom actually operate on real life. Dr. Wetherell and I talked of him without reserve in his own presence. Wetherell: "I would have given him 100 guineas if he would have written a preface to his Political Tracts, by way of a discourse on the British Constitution." Boswell: "Dr. Johnson, though in his writings and upon all occasions a great friend to the Constitution both in church and state, has never written expressly in support of either. There is really a claim upon him for both. I am sure he could give a volume of no great bulk upon each, which would comprise all the substance, and with his spirit would effectually maintain them. He should erect a fort to the confines of each." I could perceive that he was displeased with this dialogue. He burst out, "Why should I be always writing?" I hoped he was conscious that the debt was just, and meant to discharge it, though he disliked being dunned. We then went to Pembroke College, and waited on his old friend Dr. Adams, the master of it, whom I found to be a most polite, pleasing, communicative man. Before his advancement to the headship of this college, I had intended to go and visit him at Shrewsbury, where he was rector at St. Chad's, in order to get from him what particulars he could recollect of Johnson's academical life. He now obligingly gave me part of that authentic information, which, with what I afterwards owed to his kindness, will be found incorporated in its proper place in this work. Dr. Adams had distinguished himself by an able answer to David Hume's Essay on Miracles. He told me he had once dined in company with Hume in London, that Hume shook hands with him and said, "You have treated me much better than I deserve," and that they exchanged visits. I took the liberty to object to treating an infidel writer with smooth civility. Where there is a controversy concerning a passage in a classic author, or concerning a question in antiquities, or any other subject in which human happiness is not deeply interested, a man may treat his antagonist with politeness and even respect. But where the controversy is concerning the truth of religion, it is of such vast importance to him who maintains it, to obtain the victory, that the person of an opponent ought not to be spared. If a man firmly believes that religion is an invaluable treasure, he will consider a writer who endeavours to deprive mankind of it as a robber. He will look upon him as odious, though the infidel might think himself in the right. A robber who reasons as the gang do in The Beggar's Opera, who call themselves practical philosophers, and may have as much sincerity as pernicious speculative philosophers, is not the less an object of just indignation. An abandoned profligate may think that it is not wrong to debauch my wife. But shall I, therefore, not detest him? And if I catch him in making an attempt, shall I treat him with politeness? No, I will kick him down the stairs, or run him through the body, that is, if I really love my wife, or have a true rational notion of honour. An infidel then shall not be treated handsomely by a Christian, merely because he endeavours to rob with ingenuity. I do declare, however, that I am exceedingly unwilling to be provoked to anger, and could I be persuaded that truth would not suffer from a cool moderation in its defenders, I should wish to preserve good humour, at least, in every controversy. Nor, indeed, do I see why a man should lose his temper when he does all he can to refute an opponent. I think ridicule may be fairly used against an infidel. For instance, if he be an ugly fellow, and yet absurdly vain of his person, we may contrast his appearance with Cicero's beautiful image of virtue, could she be seen. Johnson coincided with me and said, when a man voluntarily engages in an important controversy, he is to do all he can to lessen his antagonist, because authority from personal respect has much weight with most people, and often more than reasoning. If my antagonist writes bad language, though that may not be essential to the question, I will attack him for his bad language. Adams. You would not jostle a chimney sweep. Johnson. Yes, sir, if it were necessary to jostle him down. Dr. Adams told us that in some of the colleges at Oxford, the fellows had excluded the students from social intercourse with them in the common room. Johnson. They are in the right, sir. There can be no real conversation, no fair exertion of mind amongst them, if the young men are by, for a man who has a character does not choose to stake it in their presence. Boswell. But, sir, may there not be very good conversation without a contest for superiority? Johnson. No animated conversation, sir, for it cannot be but one or other will come off superior. I do not mean that the victor must have the better of the argument, for he may take the weak side, but his superiority of parts and knowledge will necessarily appear. And he to whom he thus shows himself superior is lessened in the eyes of the young men. You know, it was said, Melem cum scaligero errare quam cum clavio recte sapere. In the same manner, take Bentley's and Jason D. Norris's comments upon Horace. You will admire Bentley more when wrong than Jason when right. We walked with Dr. Adams into the master's garden, and into the common room. Johnson, after a reverie of meditation, Aye, here I used to play at draughts with Phil Jones and Fludyer. Jones loved beer, and did not get very forward in the church. Fludyer turned out a scoundrel, a Whig, and said he was ashamed of having been bred at Oxford. He had a living at Putney, and got under the eye of some retainers to the court at that time, and so became a violent Whig, but he had been a scoundrel all along, to be sure. Boswell. Was he a scoundrel, sir, in any other way than that of being a political scoundrel? Did he cheat at draughts? Johnson. Sir, we never played for money. He then carried me to visit Dr. Bentham, canon of Christ Church, and divinity professor, with whose learned and lively conversation we were much pleased. He gave us an invitation to dinner, which Dr. Johnson told me was a high honour. Sir, it is a great thing to dine with the canons of Christ Church. We could not accept his invitation, as we were engaged to dine at University College. We had an excellent dinner there, with a master and fellows, it being St. Cuthbert's Day, which is kept by them as a festival, as he was a saint of Durham, with which this college is much connected. We drank tea with Dr. Home, late president of Magdalen College, and Bishop of Norwich, of whose abilities in different respects the public has had eminent proofs, and the esteem annexed to whose character was increased by knowing him personally. He had talked of publishing an edition of Walton's Lives, but he had laid aside that design upon Dr. Johnson's telling him, from mistake, that Lord Hailes intended to do it. I had wished to negotiate between Lord Hailes and him, that one or other should perform so good a work. Johnson: in order to do it well, it will be necessary to collect all the editions of Walton's Lives. By way of adapting the book to the taste of the present age, they have, in a later edition, left out a vision which he relates Dr. John had, but it should be restored, and there should be a critical catalogue given of the works of the different persons whose lives were written by Walton, and therefore their works must be carefully read by the editor. We then went to Trinity College, where he introduced me to Mr. Thomas Warton, with whom we passed a part of the evening. We talked of biography. Johnson: it is rarely well executed. They only who live with a man can write his life with any genuine exactness and discrimination, and few people who have lived with a man know what to remark about him. The chaplain of a late bishop, whom I was to assist in writing some memoirs of his lordship, could tell me scarcely anything. I said, Mr. Robert Dodsley's life should be written, as he had been so much connected with the wits of his time, and by his literary merit had raised himself from the station of a footman. Mr. Warton said he had published a little volume under the title of The Muse in Livery. Johnson: I doubt whether Dodsley's brother would thank a man who should write his life, yet Dodsley himself was not unwilling that his original low condition should be recollected. When Lord Lyttelton's Dialogues of the Dead came out, one of which is between Apicius, an ancient epicure, and Dartineuf, a modern epicure, Dodsley said to me, I know Dartineuf well, for I was once his footman. Biography led us to speak of Dr. John Campbell, who had written a considerable part of the Biographia Britannica. Johnson, though he valued him highly, was of opinion that there was not so much in his great work, A Political Survey of Great Britain, as the world had been taught to expect, and had said to me that he believed Campbell's disappointment, on account of the bad success of that work, had killed him. He this evening observed of it that the work was his death. Mr. Warton, not adverting to his meaning, answered, I believe so, from the great attention he bestowed on it. Johnson: nay, sir, he died of want of attention, if he died at all by that book. We talked of a work much in vogue at that time, written in a very mellifluous style, but which, under pretext of another subject, contained much artful infidelity. I said it was not fair to attack us thus unexpectedly. He should have warned us of our danger, before we entered his garden of flowery eloquence, by advertising spring guns and men traps set here. The author had been an Oxonian, and was remembered there for having turned papist. I observed that as he had changed several times from the Church of England to the Church of Rome, from the Church of Rome to infidelity, I did not despair yet of seeing him a Methodist preacher. Johnson, laughing: it is said that his range has been more extensive, and that he has once been Mahometan. However, now that he has published his infidelity, he will probably persist in it. Boswell: I am not quite sure of that, sir. I mentioned Sir Richard Steele having published his Christian Hero, with the avowed purpose of obliging himself to lead a religious life. Yet that his conduct was by no means strictly suitable. Johnson. Steele, I believe, practised the lighter vices. Mr. Wharton, being engaged, could not sup with us at our inn. We had therefore another evening by ourselves. I asked Johnson whether a man's being forward to make himself known to eminent people, and seeing as much of life, and getting as much information as he could in every way, was not yet lessening himself by his forwardness. Johnson. No, sir, a man always makes himself greater as he increases his knowledge. I censured some ludicrous fantastic dialogues between two coach horses and other such stuff, which Baretti had lately published. He joined with me and said, nothing odd will do long. Tristram Shandy did not last. I expressed a desire to be acquainted with a lady who had been much talked of, and universally celebrated for extraordinary address and insinuation. Johnson. Never believe extraordinary characters which you hear of people. Depend upon it, sir, they are exaggerated. You do not see one man shoot a great deal higher than another. I mentioned Mr. Burke. Johnson. Yes, Burke is an extraordinary man. His stream of mind is perpetual. It is very pleasing for me to record that Johnson's high estimation of the talents of this gentleman was uniform from their early acquaintance. Sir Joshua Reynolds informs me that when Mr. Burke was first elected a member of Parliament, and Sir John Hawkins expressed a wonder at his attaining a seat, Johnson said, now we who know Mr. Burke know that he will be one of the finest men in this country. And once, when Johnson was ill, and unable to exert himself as much as usual without fatigue, Mr. Burke having been mentioned, he said, that fellow calls forth all my powers. Were I to see Burke now, it would kill me. So much was he accustomed to consider conversation as a contest, and such was his notion of Burke as an opponent. Next morning, Thursday, March 31st, we set out in a post-chaise to pursue our ramble. It was a delightful day, and we rode through Blenheim Park. When I looked at the magnificent bridge built by John Duke of Marlborough over a small rivulet, and collected the epigram made upon it, the lofty arch his high ambition shows, the stream an emblem of his bounty flows, and saw that now, by the genius of Brown, a magnificent body of water was collected, I said, they have drowned the epigram. I observed to him, while in the midst of the noble scene around us, you and I, sir, have, I think, seen together the extremes of what can be seen in Britain, the wild rough island of Mull, and Blenheim Park. We dined at an excellent inn at Chapel House, where he expatiated on the felicity of England in its taverns and inns, and triumphed over the French for not having, in any perfection, the tavern life. There is no private house, said he, in which people can enjoy themselves so well as at a capital tavern. Let there be ever so great plenty of good things, ever so much grandeur, ever so much elegance, ever so much desire that everybody should be easy. In the nature of things it cannot be. There must always be some degree of care and anxiety. The master of the house is anxious to entertain his guests, but the guests are anxious to be agreeable to him, and no man, but a very impudent dog, indeed, can as freely command what is in another man's house as if it were his own. Whereas, at a tavern, there is a general freedom from anxiety. You are sure you are welcome, and the more noise you make, the more trouble you give, the more good things you call for, the welcomer you are. No servants will attend you with the alacrity which waiters do, who are incited by the prospect of an immediate reward in proportion as they please. No, sir, there is nothing which has yet been contrived by man, by which so much happiness is produced as by a good tavern or inn. He then repeated with great emotion Shenstone's lines: Whoe'er has travelled life's dull round, where'er his stages may have been, may sigh to think he still has found the warmest welcome at an inn. My illustrious friend, I thought, did not sufficiently admire Shenstone. That ingenious and elegant gentleman's opinion of Johnson appears in one of his letters to Mr. Graves, dated February 9, 1760. I have lately been reading 1 or 2 volumes of The Rambler, who, excepting against some few hardnesses in his manner and want of more examples to enliven, is one of the most nervous, most perspicuous, most concise, and most harmonious prose writers I have known. A learned dictation improves by time. In the afternoon, as we were driven rapidly along in the post-chaise, he said to me, "Life has not many things better than this." We stopped at Stratford-upon-Avon, and drank tea and coffee, and it pleased me to be with him upon the classic ground of Shakespeare's native place. He spoke slightingly of Dyer's Fleece. "The subject, sir, cannot be made poetical. How can a man write poetically of serges and druggets? Yet you will hear many people talk, to you greatly, of that excellent poem, The Fleece." Having talked of Granger's Sugar Cane, I mentioned to him Mr. Langton's having told me that this poem, when read in manuscript at Sir Joshua Reynolds', had made all the assembled wits burst into a laugh, when, after much blank verse pomp, the poet began a new paragraph thus: "Now, Muse, let's sing of rats." And what increased the ridicule was, that one of the company, who slyly overlooked the reader, perceived that the word had been originally mice, and had been altered to rats, as more dignified. This passage does not appear in the printed work. Dr. Granger, or some of his friends, it should seem, having become sensible that introducing even rats in a grave poem might be liable to banter. He, however, could not bring himself to relinquish the idea, for they are thus, in a still more ludicrous manner, paraphrastically exhibited in his poem as it now stands: "Nor with less waste the whiskered vermin race, a countless clan despoil the lowland cane." Johnson said that Dr. Granger was an agreeable man, a man who would do any good that was in his power. His translation of Tibullus, he thought, was very well done, but the Sugar Cane, a poem, did not please him, for, he exclaimed, what could he make of a sugar cane? One might as well write The Parsley Bed, a poem, or The Cabbage Garden, a poem. Boswell: "You must then pickle your cabbage with the sal atticum." Johnson: "You know there is already The Hop Garden, a poem, and I think one could say a great deal about cabbage. The poem might begin with the advantages of civilized society over a rude state, exemplified by the Scotch, who had no cabbages till Oliver Cromwell's soldiers introduced them, and one might thus show how arts are propagated by conquest, as they were by the Roman arms." He seemed to be much diverted with the fertility of his own fancy. I told him that I heard Dr. Percy was writing the history of the wolf in Great Britain. Johnson: "The wolf, sir? Why the wolf? Why does he not write of the bear, which we had formerly? Nay, it is said we had the beaver. Or why does he not write of the grey rat, the Hanover rat, as it is called, because it is said to have come into this country about the time that the family of Hanover came? I should like to see the History of the Grey Rat, by Thomas Percy, D.D., Chaplain in Ordinary to His Majesty," laughing immoderately. Boswell: "I am afraid a court chaplain could not decently write of the grey rat." Johnson: "Sir, he need not give it the name of the Hanover rat. Thus he could indulge a luxuriant sportive imagination, when talking of a friend whom he loved and esteemed." He mentioned to me the singular history of an ingenious acquaintance. He had practised physic in various situations with no great emolument. A West India gentleman, whom he delighted by his conversation, gave him a bond for a handsome annuity during his life, on the condition of his accompanying him to the West Indies, and living with him there for 2 years. He accordingly embarked with the gentleman, but upon the voyage he fell in love with a young woman who happened to be one of the passengers, and married the wench. From the impudence of his disposition he quarrelled with the gentleman, and declared he would have no connection with him. So he forfeited the annuity. he settled as a physician in one of the Leeward Islands. A man was sent out to him merely to compound his medicines. This fellow set up as a rival to him in his practice of physic, and got so much the better of him in the opinion of the people of the island that he carried away all the business, upon which he returned to England and soon after died. End of section 21. Recording by Katie Riley. April 2009. Section 22 of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2, by James Boswell. Section 22, 1776, continued. On Friday, March 22nd, having set out early from Henley, where we had lain the preceding night, we arrived at Birmingham about 9 o'clock, and, after breakfast, went to call on his old schoolfellow, Mr. Hector. A very stupid maid, who opened the door, told us that her master was gone out. He was gone to the country, she could not tell when he would return. In short, she gave us a miserable reception, and Johnson observed she would have behaved no better to people who wanted him in the way of his profession. He said to her, "My name is Johnson. Tell him I called. Will you remember the name?" She answered with rustic simplicity, in the Warwickshire pronunciation, "I don't understand you, sir." "Blockhead," said he. "I'll write." I never heard the word blockhead applied to a woman before, though I do not see why it should not, when there is evident occasion for it. He, however, made another attempt to make her understand him, and roared loud in her ear, "Johnson," and then she catched the sound. We next called on Mr. Lloyd, one of the people called Quakers. He, too, was not at home, but Mrs. Lloyd was, and received us courteously, and asked us to dinner. Johnson said to me, after the uncertainty of all human things at Hector's, this invitation came very well. We walked about the town, and he was pleased to see it increasing. I talked of legitimation by subsequent marriage, which obtained in the Roman law, and still obtains in the law of Scotland. Johnson: I think it is a bad thing, because the chastity of women being of the utmost importance, as all property depends upon it, they who forfeit it should not have any possibility of being restored to good character, nor should the children, by an illicit connection, attain the full right of lawful children by the posterior consent of the offending parties. His opinion upon the subject deserves consideration. Upon his principle, there may, at times, be a hardship, and seemingly a strange one, upon individuals, but the general good of society is better secured. And after all, it is unreasonable in an individual to repine that he has not the advantage of a state which is made different from his own, by the social institution under which he is born. A woman does not complain that her brother, who is younger than her, gets their common father's estate. Why then should a natural son complain that a younger brother, by the same parents lawfully begotten, gets it? The operation of law is similar in both cases. Besides, an illegitimate son, who has a younger legitimate brother by the same father and mother, has no stronger claim to the father's estate than if that legitimate brother had only the same father, from whom alone the estate descends. Mr. Lloyd joined us in the street, and in a little while we met friend Hector, as Mr. Lloyd called him. It gave me pleasure to observe the joy which Johnson and he expressed on seeing each other again. Mr. Lloyd and I left them together, while he obligingly showed me some of the manufactures of this very curious assemblage of artificers. We all met at dinner at Mr. Lloyd's, where we were entertained with great hospitality. Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd had been married the same year with their Majesties, and like them, had been blessed with a numerous family of fine children, their numbers being exactly the same. Johnson said, "Marriage is the best state for a man in general, and every man is a worse man in proportion as he is unfit for the married state." I have always loved the simplicity of manners, and the spiritual mindedness of the Quakers, and talking with Mr. Lloyd, I observed that the essential part of religion was piety, a devout intercourse with the divinity, and that many a man was a Quaker without knowing it. As Dr. Johnson had said to me in the morning while we walked together, that he liked hearing individuals among the Quakers, but not the sect, when we were at Mr. Lloyd's, I kept clear of introducing any questions concerning the peculiarities of their faith. But I having asked to look at Baskerville's edition of Barclay's Apology, Johnson laid hold of it, and the chapter on baptism happening to be open, Johnson remarked, "He says there is neither precept nor practice for baptism in the Scriptures. That is false." Here he was the aggressor, by no means in a gentle manner, and the good Quakers had the advantage of him, for he had read negligently, and had not observed that Barclay speaks of infant baptism, which they calmly made him perceive. Mr. Lloyd, however, was in as great a mistake, for when insisting that the rite of baptism by water was to cease, when the spiritual administration of Christ began, he maintained that John the Baptist said, "My baptism shall decrease, but his shall increase," whereas the words are, "He must increase, but I must decrease." One of them having objected to the observance of days and months and years, Johnson answered, "The Church does not superstitiously observe days, merely as days, but as memorials of important facts. Christmas might be kept as well upon one day of the year as another, but there should be a stated day for commemorating the birth of our Saviour, because there is danger that what may be done on any day will be neglected." He said to me at another time, "Sir, the holidays observed by our Church are of great use in religion. There can be no doubt of this in a limited sense, I mean if the numbers of such consecrated portions of time be not too extensive. The excellent Mr. Nelson's Festivals and Fasts, which has, I understand, the greatest sale of any book ever printed in England except the Bible, is a most valuable help to devotion, and in addition to it, I would recommend 2 sermons on the same subject by Mr. Pott, Archdeacon of St. Albans, equally distinguished for his piety and elegance. I am sorry to have to say it, that Scotland is the only Christian country, Catholic or Protestant, where the great events of our religion are not solemnly commemorated by its ecclesiastical establishment on days set apart for the purpose. Mr. Hector was so good as to accompany me to see the great works of Mr. Bolton, at a place which he has called Soho, about 2 miles from Birmingham, which the very ingenious proprietor showed me himself to the best advantage. I wish Johnson had been with us, for it was a scene which I should have been glad to contemplate by his light. The vastness and the contrivance of some of the machinery would have matched his mighty mind. I shall never forget Mr. Bolton's expression to me, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have, power." He had about 700 people at work. I contemplated him as an iron chieftain, and he seemed to be a father to his tribe. One of them came to him, complaining grievously of his landlord for having distrained his goods. "Your landlord is in the right, Smith," said Bolton, "but I'll tell you what, find you a friend who will lay down 1/2 of your rent, and I'll lay down the other half, and you shall have your goods again." From Mr. Hector I now learnt many particulars of Dr. Johnson's early life, which, with others that he gave me at different times since, have contributed to the formation of this work. Dr. Johnson said to me in the morning, "You will see, sir, at Mr. Hector's, his sister, Mrs. Careless, a clergyman's widow. She was the first woman with whom I was in love. It dropped out of my head imperceptibly, but she and I shall always have a kindness for each other." He laughed at the notion that a man can never be really in love but once, and considered it as a mere romantic fancy. On our return from Mr. Bolton's, Mr. Hector took me to his house, where we found Johnson sitting placidly at tea with his first love, who, though now advanced in years, was a genteel woman, very agreeable and well bred. Johnson lamented to Mr. Hector the state of one of their schoolfellows, Mr. Charles Congreve, a clergyman, which he thus described: "He obtained, I believe, a considerable preferment in Ireland, but now lives in London, quite a valetudinarian, afraid to go into any house but his own. He takes a short airing in his post-chaise every day. He has an elderly woman, whom he calls cousin, who lives with him, and jogs his elbow when his glass has stood too long empty, and encourages him in drinking, in which he is very willing to be encouraged. Not that he gets drunk, for he is a very pious man, but he is always muddy. He confesses to 1 bottle of port every day, and he probably drinks more. He is quite unsocial. His conversation is quite monosyllabical. And when, at my last visit, I asked him what o'clock was, that signal of my departure had so pleasing an effect on him that he sprung up to look at his watch like a greyhound bounding at a hare." When Johnson took leave of Mr. Hector, he said, "Don't grow like Congreve, nor let me grow like him when you are near me." When he again talked of Mrs. Careless tonight, he seemed to have had his affection revived, for he said, "If I had married her, it might have been as happy for me." Boswell: "Pray, sir, do you not suppose that there are 50 women in the world, with any one of whom a man may be as happy as with any one woman in particular?" Johnson: "Ay, sir, 50,000. Boswell: "Then, sir, you are not of opinion with some who imagine that certain men and certain women are made for each other, and that they cannot be happy if they miss their counterparts?" Johnson: "To be sure not, sir. I believe marriages would in general be as happy, and often more so, if they were all made by the Lord Chancellor, upon a due consideration of characters and circumstances, without the parties having any choice in the matter." I wished to have stayed at Birmingham tonight, to have talked more with Mr. Hector, but my friend was impatient to reach his native city, so we drove on that stage in the dark, and were long pensive and silent. When we came within the focus of the Lichfield lamps, "Now," he said, "we are getting out of a stale death." We put up at the 3 Crowns, not one of the great inns, but a good old-fashioned one, which was kept by Mr. Wilkins, and was the very next house to that in which Johnson was born and brought up, and which was still his own property. We had a comfortable supper, and got into high spirits. I felt all my Toryism glow in this old capital of Staffordshire. I could have offered incense, genoi loci, and I indulged in libations of that ale which Boniface, in the Beaux Stratagem, recommends with such an eloquent jollity. Next morning he introduced me to Mrs. Lucy Porter, his stepdaughter. She was now an old maid, with much simplicity of manner. She had never been in London. Her brother, a captain in the navy, had left her a fortune of 10,000 pounds, about a third of which she had laid out in building a stately house, and making a handsome garden in an elevated situation in Lichfield. Johnson, when here by himself, used to live at her house. She reverenced him, and he had a parental tenderness for her. We then visited Mr. Peter Garrick, who had that morning received a letter from his brother David, announcing our coming to Lichfield. He was engaged to dinner, but asked us to tea, and to sleep at his house. Johnson, however, would not quit his old acquaintance, Wilkins, of the 3 Crowns. The family likeness of the Garricks was very striking, and Johnson thought that David's vivacity was not so peculiar to himself as was supposed. "Sir," said he, "I don't know but if Peter had cultivated all the arts of gaiety as much as David has done, he might have been as brisk and lively. Depend upon it, sir, vivacity is much an art, and depends greatly on habit." I believe there is a good deal of truth in this, notwithstanding a ludicrous story told me by a lady abroad of a heavy German baron, who had lived much with the young English at Geneva, and was ambitious to be as lively as they, with which view he with assiduous exertion was jumping over the tables and chairs in his lodgings, and when the people of the house ran in and asked, with surprise, what the matter was, he answered, "J'apprends titre vif." We dined at our inn, and had with us a Mr. Jackson, one of Johnson's schoolfellows, whom he treated with much kindness, though he seemed to be a low man, dull and untaught. He had a coarse grey coat, black waistcoat, greasy leather breeches, and a yellow uncurled wig, and his countenance had the ruddiness which betokens one who is in no haste to leave his can. He drank only ale. He had tried to be a cutler at Birmingham, but had not succeeded, and now he lived poorly at home, and had some scheme of dressing leather in a better manner than common, to his indistinct account of which Dr. Johnson listened with patient attention, that he might assist him with his advice. Here was an instance of genuine humanity and real kindness in this great man, who had been most unjustly represented as altogether harsh and destitute of tenderness. 1,000 such instances might have been recorded in the course of his long life, though that his temper was warm and hasty, and his manner often rough, cannot be denied. I saw here for the first time oat ale, and oat cakes, not as hard as in Scotland, but soft like a Yorkshire cake, were served at breakfast. It was pleasant to me to find that oats, the food of the horses, were so much used as the food of the people in Dr. Johnson's own town. He expatiated in praise of Lichfield and its inhabitants, who, he said, were the most sober, decent people in England, the genteelest in proportion to their wealth, and spoke the purest English. I doubted as to the last article of this eulogy, for they had several provincial sounds, as there, pronounced like fear, instead of like fair, once, pronounced wounds, instead of ones or wands. Johnson himself never got entirely free of those provincial accents. Garrick sometimes used to take him off, squeezing a lemon into a punch bowl with uncouth gesticulations, looking round the company and calling out, "Who's for punch?" Very little business appeared to be going forward in Lichfield. I found, however, 2 strange manufactures for so inland a place, sailcloth and streamers for ships, and I observed them making some saddle-cloths and dressing sheepskins, but upon the whole the busy hand of industry seemed to be quite slackened. "Surely, sir," said I, "you are an idle set of people." "Sir," said Johnson, "we are a city of philosophers. We work with our heads, and make the boobies of Birmingham work for us with their hands." There was at this time a company of players performing at Lichfield. The manager, Mr. Stanton, sent his compliments, and begged leave to wait on Dr. Johnson. Johnson received him very courteously, and he drank a glass of wine with us. He was a plain, decent, well-behaved man, and expressed his gratitude to Dr. Johnson for having once got him permission from Dr. Taylor at Ashbourne to play there upon moderate terms. Garrick's name was soon introduced. Johnson: "Garrick's conversation is gay and grotesque. It is a dish of all sorts, but all good things. There is no solid meat in it, there is a want of sentiment in it. Not but that he has sentiment sometimes, and sentiment, too, very powerful and very pleasing, but it has not its full proportion in his conversation." When we were by ourselves, he told me, 40 years ago, sir, I was in love with an actress here, Mrs. Emmett, who acted Flora in Hob in the Well. What merit this lady has as an actress, or what was her figure, or her manner, I have not been informed. But, if we may believe Mr. Garrick, his old master's taste in theatrical merit was by no means refined. He was not an elegans formarum spectator. Garrick used to tell that Johnson said of an actor who played Sir Harry Wildair at Lichfield, "There is a courtly vivacity about the fellow," when in fact, according to Garrick's account, he was the most vulgar ruffian that ever went upon boards. We had promised Mr. Stanton to be at his theatre on Monday. Dr. Johnson jocularly proposed me to write a prologue for the occasion, a prologue by James Boswell, Esquire, from the Hebrides. I was really inclined to take the hint. Methought, prologue spoken before Dr. Samuel Johnson at Lichfield, 1776, would have sounded as well as prologue spoken before the Duke of York at Oxford, in Charles II's time. Much might have been said of what Lichfield had done for Shakespeare by producing Johnson and Garrick, but I found he was averse to it. We went and viewed the museum of Mr. Richard Green, apothecary here, who told me he was proud of being a relation of Dr. Johnson's. It was truly a wonderful collection, both of antiques and natural curiosities, and ingenious works of art. He had all the articles accurately arranged, with their names upon labels, printed at his own little press, and on the staircase leading to it was a board, with the names of contributors marked in gold letters. A printed catalogue of the collection was to be had at a bookseller's. Johnson expressed his admiration of the activity and diligence and good fortune of Mr. Green in getting together, in his situation, so great a variety of things, and Mr. Green told me that Johnson once said to him, "Sir, I should as soon have thought of building a man of war as of collecting such a museum." Mr. Green's obliging alacrity in showing it was very pleasing. His engraved portrait, with which he has favoured me, has a motto truly characteristical of his disposition: Nemo sibi vivat. A physician being mentioned who had lost his practice because his whimsically changing his religion had made people distrustful of him, I maintained that this was unreasonable, as religion is unconnected with medical skill. Johnson: "Sir, it is not unreasonable, for when people see a man absurd in what they understand, they may conclude the same of him in what they do not understand. If a physician were to take to eating horseflesh, nobody would employ him, though one may eat horseflesh and be a very skilful physician. If a man were educated in an absurd religion, his continuing to profess it would not hurt him, though his changing to it would." We drank tea and coffee at Mr. Peter Garrick's, where was Mrs. Aston, one of the maiden sisters of Mrs. Walmsley, wife of Johnson's first friend, and sister also of the lady of whom Johnson used to speak with the warmest admiration by the name of Molly Aston, who was afterwards married to Captain Brodie of the Navy. On Sunday, March 24th, we breakfasted with Mrs. Cobb, a widow lady who lived in an agreeable sequestered place close by the town, called the Friary, it having been formerly a religious house. She and her niece, Miss Addie, were great admirers of Dr. Johnson, and he behaved to them with a kindness and easy pleasantry such as we see between old and intimate acquaintance. He accompanied Mrs. Cobb to St. Mary's Church, and I went to the cathedral, where I was very much delighted with the music, finding it to be peculiarly solemn and accordant with the words of the service. We dined at Mr. Peter Garrick's, who was in a very lively humour, and verified Johnson's saying that if he had cultivated gaiety as much as his brother David, he might have equally excelled in it. He was today quite a London narrator, telling us a variety of anecdotes, with that earnestness and attempt at mimicry which we usually find in the wits of the metropolis. Dr. Johnson went with me to the cathedral in the afternoon. It was grand and pleasing to contemplate this illustrious writer, now full of fame, worshipping in the solemn temple of his native city. I returned to tea and coffee at Mr. Peter Garrick's, and then found Dr. Johnson at the Reverend Mr. Seward's, canon residentiary, who inhabited the bishop's palace, in which Mr. Walmsley lived, and which had been the scene of many happy hours in Johnson's early life. Mr. Seward had, with ecclesiastical hospitality and politeness, asked me in the morning, merely as a stranger, to dine with him, and in the afternoon, when I was introduced to him, he asked Dr. Johnson and me to spend the evening and sup with him. He was a genteel, well-bred, dignified clergyman who had travelled with Lord Charles Fitzroy, uncle of the present Duke of Grafton, who died when abroad, and he had lived much in the great world. He was an ingenious and literary man, had published an edition of Beaumont and Fletcher, and written verses in Dodsley's collection. His lady was the daughter of Mr. Hunter, Johnson's first schoolmaster. And now, for the first time, I had the pleasure of seeing his celebrated daughter, Miss Anna Seward, to whom I have since been indebted for many civilities, as well as some obliging communications concerning Johnson. Mr. Seward mentioned to us the observations which he had made upon the strata of earth and volcanoes, from which it appeared that they were so very different in depth at different periods that no calculation whatever could be made as to the time required for their formation. This fully refuted an anti-Mosaical remark introduced into Captain Brydone's entertaining tour, I hope heedlessly, from a kind of vanity which is too common in those who have not sufficiently studied the most important of all subjects. Dr. Johnson, indeed, has said before, independent of this observation, "Shall all the accumulated evidence of the history of the world, shall the authority of what is unquestionably the most ancient writing, be overturned by an uncertain remark such as this?" On Monday, March 25th, we breakfasted at Mrs. Lucy Porter's. Johnson had sent an express to Dr. Taylor's, acquainting him of our being at Lichfield, and Taylor had returned an answer that his post-chaise should come for us this day. While we sat at breakfast, Dr. Johnson received a letter by the post, which seemed to agitate him very much. When he had read it, he exclaimed, "One of the most dreadful things that has happened in my time." The phrase "my time," like the word age, is usually understood to refer to an event of a public or general nature. I imagine something like an assassination of the king, like a gunpowder plot carried into execution, or like another fire of London. When asked, "What is it, sir?" he answered, "Mr. Thrale has lost his only son." This was, no doubt, a very great affliction to Mr. and Mrs. Thrale, which their friends would consider accordingly, but from the manner in which the intelligence of it was communicated by Johnson, it appeared for the moment to be comparatively small. I, however, soon felt a sincere concern, and was curious to observe how Dr. Johnson would be affected. He said, "This is a total extinction to their family, as much as if they were sold into captivity." Upon my mentioning that Mr. Thrale had daughters who might inherit his wealth, "Daughters," said Johnson, warmly, "he'll no more value his daughters than—" I was going to speak. "Sir," said he, "don't you know how you yourself think? Sir, he wishes to propagate his name." In short, I saw male succession strong in his mind, even when there was no name, no family of any long standing. I said it was lucky he was not present when this misfortune happened. Johnson: "It is lucky for me. People in distress never think that you feel enough." Boswell: "And, sir, they will have the hope of seeing you, which will be a relief in the meantime, and when you get to them, the pain will be so far abated that they will be capable of being consoled by you, which, in the first violence of it, I believe, would not be the case. Johnson. No, sir. Violent pain of mind, like violent pain of body, must be severely felt. Boswell. I own, sir, I have not so much feeling for the distress of others as some people have, or pretend to have. But I know this, that I would do all in my power to relieve them. Johnson. Sir, it is affectation to pretend to feel the distress of others as much as they do themselves. It is equally so, as if one should pretend to feel as much pain while a friend's leg is cutting off as he does. No, sir, you have expressed the rational and just nature of sympathy. I would have gone to the extremity of the earth to have preserved this boy. He was soon quite calm. The letter was from Mr. Thrale's clerk, and concluded, I need not say how much they wish to see you in London. He said, we shall hasten back from Taylor's. Mrs. Lucy Porter and some other ladies of the place talked a great deal of him when he was out of the room, not only with veneration, but affection. It pleased me to find that he was so much beloved in his native city. Mrs. Aston, whom I had seen the preceding night, and her sister, Mrs. Gastrell, a widow lady, had each a house and garden and pleasure ground prettily situated upon Stow Hill, a gentle eminence adjoining to Lichfield. Johnson walked away to dinner there, leaving me by myself without any apology. I wondered at this want of that facility of manners from which a man has no difficulty in carrying a friend to a house where he is intimate. I felt it very unpleasant to be thus left in solitude in a country town, where I was an entire stranger, and began to think myself unkindly deserted. But I was soon relieved, and convinced that my friend, instead of being deficient in delicacy, had conducted the matter with perfect propriety, for I received the following note in his handwriting. Mrs. Gastrell, at the lower house on Stow Hill, desires Mr. Boswell's company to dinner at 2. I accepted the invitation, and had here another proof how amiable his character was in the opinion of those who knew him best. I was not informed till afterwards that Mrs. Gastrell's husband was the clergyman who, while he lived at Stratford-upon-Avon, where he was proprietor of Shakespeare's garden, with Gothic barbarity cut down his mulberry tree, and, as Dr. Johnson told me, did it to vex his neighbours. His lady, I have reason to believe, on the same authority, participated in the guilt of what the enthusiasts of our immortal bard deem almost a species of sacrilege. After dinner, Dr. Johnson wrote a letter to Mrs. Thrale on the death of her son. I said it would be very distressing to Thrale, but she would soon forget it, as she had so many things to think of. Johnson. No, sir, Thrale will forget it first. She has many things that she may think of. He has many things that he must think of. This was a very just remark upon the different effect of those pursuits which occupy a vacant and easy mind, and those serious engagements which arrest attention and keep us from brooding over grief. He observed of Lord Bute, it was said of Augustus that it would have been better for Rome that he had never been born, or had never died. So it would have been better for this nation if Lord Bute had never been minister, or had never resigned. In the evening we went to the town hall, which was converted into a temporary theatre, and saw the Odysseus, with the Stratford Jubilee. I was happy to see Dr. Johnson sitting in a conspicuous part of the pit, and receiving affectionate homage from all his acquaintance. We were quite gay and merry. I afterwards mentioned to him that I condemned myself for being so, when poor Mr. and Mrs. Thrale were in such distress. Johnson. You are wrong, sir. 20 years hence, Mr. and Mrs. Thrale will not suffer much pain from the death of their son. Now, sir, you are to consider that distance of place, as well as distance of time, operates upon the human feelings. I would not have you be gay in the presence of the distressed, because it would shock them, but you may be gay at a distance. Pain for the loss of a friend, or of a relation whom we love, is occasioned by the want which we feel. In time, the vacuity is filled with something else, or sometimes the vacuity closes up of itself. Mr. Seward and Mr. Pearson, another clergyman here, supped with us at our inn, and after they left us, we sat up late as we used to do in London. Here I shall record some fragments of my friend's conversation during this jaunt. Marriage, sir, is much more necessary to a man than to a woman, for he is much less able to supply himself with domestic comforts. You will recollect my saying to some ladies the other day that I had often wondered why young women should marry, as they have so much more freedom, and so much more attention paid to them while unmarried than when married. I indeed did not mention the strong reason for their marrying, the mechanical reason. Boswell. Why, that is a strong one, but does not imagination make it much more important than it is in reality? Is it not, to a certain degree, a delusion in us as well as in women? Johnson. Why, yes, sir, but it is a delusion that is always beginning again. Boswell. I don't know, but there is upon the whole more misery than happiness produced by that passion. Johnson. I don't think so, sir. Never speak of a man in his own presence. It is always indelicate, and may be offensive. Questioning is not the mode of conversation among gentlemen. It is assuming a superiority, and it is particularly wrong to question a man concerning himself. There may be parts of his former life which he may not wish to be made known to other persons, or even brought to his own recollection. A man should be careful never to tell tales of himself to his own disadvantage. People may be amused and laugh at the time, but they will be remembered and brought out against him upon some subsequent occasion. Much may be done if a man puts his whole mind to a particular object. By doing so, Norton has made himself the great lawyer that he is allowed to be. I mentioned an acquaintance of mine, a secretary, who was a very religious man, who not only attended regularly on public worship with those of his communion, but made a particular study of the Scriptures, and even wrote a commentary on some parts of them, yet was known to be very licentious in indulging himself with women, maintaining that men are to be saved by faith alone, and that the Christian religion had not prescribed any fixed rule for the intercourse between the sexes. Johnson. Sir, there is no trusting to that crazy piety. I observed that it was strange how well Scotchmen were known to one another in their own country, though being born in very distant counties, for we do not find that the gentlemen of neighbouring counties in England are mutually known to each other. Johnson, with his usual acuteness, at once saw and explained the reason of this. Why, sir, you have Edinburgh, where the gentlemen from all your counties meet, and which is not so large, but they are all known. There is no such common place of collection in England, except London, where from its great size and diffusion, many of those who reside in contiguous counties of England may long remain unknown to each other. On Tuesday, March 26th, there came for us an equipage properly suited to a wealthy, well-beneficed clergyman, Dr. Taylor's large roomy post-chaise, drawn by 4 stout, plump horses, and driven by 2 steady, jolly postilions, which conveyed us to Ashbourne, where I found my friend's schoolfellow living upon an establishment perfectly corresponding with his substantial, creditable equipage, his house, garden, pleasure grounds, table, in short, everything good, and no scantiness appearing. Every man should form such a plan of living as he can execute completely. Let him not draw an outline wider than he can fill up. I have seen many skeletons of show and magnificence which excite at once ridicule and pity. Dr. Taylor has a good estate of his own, and good preferment in the church, being a prebendary of Westminster and rector of Bosworth. He was a diligent justice of the peace, and presided over the town of Ashbourne, to the inhabitants of which I was told he was very liberal; and as a proof of this, it was mentioned to me he had the preceding winter distributed £200 among such of them as stood in need of his assistance. He had consequently a considerable political interest in the county of Derby, which he employed to support the Devonshire family, for though the schoolfellow and friend of Johnson, he was a Whig. I could not perceive in his character much congeniality of any sort with that of Johnson, who, however, said to me, "Sir, he has a very strong understanding." His size, figure, and countenance, and manner were that of a hearty English squire, with a parson superinduced; and I took particular notice of his upper servant, Mr. Peters, a decent grave man in purple clothes, and a large white wig, like the butler or major domo of a bishop. Dr. Johnson and Dr. Taylor met with great cordiality, and Johnson soon gave him the same sad account of their schoolfellow Congreve that he had given to Mr. Hector, adding a remark of such moment to the rational conduct of a man in the decline of life that it deserves to be imprinted upon every mind. There is nothing against which an old man should be so much upon his guard as putting himself to nurse. Innumerable have been the melancholy instances of men once distinguished for firmness, resolution, and spirit, who in their latter days have been governed like children by interested female artifice. Dr. Taylor commended a physician who was known to him and Dr. Johnson, and said, "I fight many battles for him, as many people in the country dislike him." Johnson: "But you should consider, sir, that by every one of your victories he is a loser; for every man of whom you get the better will be very angry, and resolve not to employ him; whereas, if people get the better of you in argument about him, they'll think, we'll send for Dr. nevertheless." This was an observation deep and sure in human nature. Next day, we talked of a book, in which an eminent judge was arraigned before the bar of the public as having pronounced an unjust decision in a great cause. Dr. Johnson maintained that this publication would not give any uneasiness to the judge; for, said he, either he acted honestly, or he meant to do injustice. If he acted honestly, his own consciousness would protect him; if he meant to do injustice, he will be glad to see the man who attacks him so much vexed. Next day, as Dr. Johnson had acquainted Dr. Taylor of the reason for his returning speedily to London, it was resolved that we should set out after dinner. A few of Dr. Taylor's neighbours were his guests that day. Dr. Johnson talked with approbation of one who had attained to the state of the philosophical wise man, that is, to have no want of anything. "Then, sir," said I, "the savage is a wise man." "Sir," said he, "I do not mean simply being without, but not having a want." I maintained against this proposition that it was better to have fine clothes, for instance, than not to feel the want of them. Johnson: "No, sir, fine clothes are good only as they supply the want of other means of procuring respect. Was Charles XII, think you, less respected for his coarse blue coat and black stock? And you find the King of Prussia dresses plain, because the dignity of his character is sufficient." I here brought myself into a scrape, for I heedlessly said, "Would not you, sir, be the better for velvet and embroidery?" Johnson: "Sir, you put an end to all argument when you introduce your opponent himself. Have you no better manners? There is your want." I apologized by saying I had mentioned him as an instance of one who wanted as little as any man in the world, and yet perhaps might receive some additional lustre from dress. End of Section 22. End of the Life of Samuel Johnson, Volume 2. Recording by Katie Riley, April 2009.